Chapter 20. Simple Reproduction. Section 1. Formulation of the problem. If we consider the result of the annual functioning of the social capital, that is, of the total capital of which the individual capitals are only fractions, their movement being both an individual movement and at the same time an integral link in the movement of the total capital, if we consider therefore the commodity product which the society supplies in the course of a year, we shall necessarily be able to see how the reproduction of the social capital proceeds, what characteristics distinguish this reproduction process from the reproduction process of an individual capital, and what characteristics are common to both. The annual product includes both the parts of the social product that replace capital, social reproduction, and the parts that accrue to the consumption fund and are consumed by the workers and capitalists, i.e. both productive and unproductive consumption. This consumption thus includes the reproduction, i.e. maintenance, of the capitalist class and the working class, and hence too the reproduction of the capitalist character of the entire production process. The form of circulation that we have to analyze is evidently C' to M to C to P to C', and C' to small m to small c, and consumption necessarily plays a role in this. For the starting point, C', being C and small c, the commodity capital, includes not only constant and variable capital value, but also surplus value. This movement thus encompasses both individual consumption and productive consumption. In the circuits M to C, to P to C' to M', and P to C' to M' to C to P, the movement of capital is both the starting point and the concluding point, and this certainly also involves consumption, for the commodity, the product, has to be sold. But once this is assumed to have happened, it is immaterial for the movement of the individual capital what later becomes of this commodity. With the movement of C' to C', on the other hand, the preconditions for social reproduction can be immediately recognized from the fact that it is necessary to demonstrate what becomes of each portion of the value of this overall product C'. The overall process of reproduction here includes the consumption process mediated by circulation just as much as the reproduction of capital itself. For our present purpose, in fact, the process of reproduction has to be considered from the standpoint of the replacement of the individual components of C', both in value and in material. We can no longer content ourselves, as with the value analysis of the product of the individual capital, with the assumption that the individual capitalist first converts the components of his capital into money by selling his commodity product, and can then transform this back into productive capital by repurchasing his elements of production on the commodity market. These elements of production, insofar as they are of the objective kind, form as much a component of the social capital as the individual finished product that is exchanged for them and replaced by them. On the other hand, the movement of the part of the social commodity product that is consumed by the worker in spending his wage, and by the capitalist in spending surplus value, not only forms an integral link in the movement of the total product, but is also interwoven with the movements of the individual capitals, so that its course, too, cannot be explained by simply being presupposed. The immediate form in which the problem presents itself is this: how is the capital consumed in production replaced in its value out of the annual product, and how is the movement of this replacement intertwined with the consumption of surplus value by the capitalist and of wages by the workers? What we are dealing with, first of all, is reproduction on a simple scale. Moreover, we assume not only that products are exchanged at their values, but also that no revolution in values takes place in the components of the productive capital. Inasmuch as prices diverge from values, this circumstance cannot exert any influence on the movement of the social capital. The same mass of products is exchanged afterwards as before, even though the value relationships in which the individual capitalists are involved are no longer proportionate to their respective advances and to the quantities of surplus value produced by each of them. As far as revolutions in value are concerned, they change nothing in the relations between the value components of the total annual product, as long as they are generally and evenly distributed. Insofar as they are only partially and unevenly distributed, they represent disturbances which firstly can be understood only if they are treated as divergences from value relations that remain unchanged, and secondly, however, given proof of the law that one part of the value of the annual product replaces constant capital and another variable capital, then a revolution, either in the value of the constant capital or in that of the variable, would in no way affect this law. It would alter only the relative magnitudes of the portions of value that function in one or the other capacity, because different values would have appeared in place of the original values. As long as we were dealing with capital's value production and the value of its product individually, the natural form of the commodity product was a matter of complete indifference for the analysis, whether it was machines or corn or mirrors. This was always simply an example, and any branch of production whatever could equally serve as illustration. What we are dealing with then was the actual immediate process of production, which presented itself at each turn as the process of an individual capital. Insofar as the reproduction of capital came into consideration, it was sufficient to assume that the opportunity arose within the circulation sphere for the part of the product that represented capital value to be transformed back into its elements of production, and therefore into its shape as productive capital, just as we could assume that the worker and capitalist found on the market the commodities on which they spent their wages and surplus value. But this purely formal manner of presentation is no longer sufficient once we consider the total social capital and the value of its product. The transformation of one portion of the product's value back into capital, the entry of another part into the individual consumption of the capitalist and working classes, forms a movement within the value of the product in which the total capital has resulted. And this movement is not only a replacement of values, but a replacement of materials, and is therefore conditioned not just by the mutual relations of the value components of the social product, but equally by their use values, their material shape. Simple reproduction on the same scale seems to be an abstraction, both in the sense that the absence of any accumulation or reproduction on an expanded scale is an assumption foreign to the capitalist basis, and in the sense that the conditions in which production takes place do not remain absolutely the same in different years, which is what is assumed here. The supposition is that a social capital of a given value supplies the same mass of commodity values and satisfies the same quantity of needs in both the current year and the previous year, even if the forms of the commodities may change in the reproduction process. But since, when accumulation takes place, simple reproduction still remains a part of this and is a real factor in accumulation, this can also be considered by itself. Moreover, the value of the annual product may decrease, even though the volume of use values remains the same. The value may remain the same even though the volume of use values declines. The value and volume of use values reproduced may decrease simultaneously. What emerges from all this is that reproduction either takes place under more favorable circumstances than previously or under more difficult ones, and the latter may result in an incomplete, defective reproduction. All this can affect only the quantitative aspect of the various elements of reproduction, and not the role that they play in the total process as capital reproducing itself, or as reproduced revenue. Section 2. The two departments of social production. The society's total product, and thus its total production process, breaks down into two great departments. 1. The means of production. Commodities that possess a form in which they either have to enter productive consumption, or at least can enter this. And 2. The means of consumption. Commodities that possess a form in which they enter the individual consumption of the capitalist and working classes. In each of these departments, all the various branches of production belonging to it form a single great branch of production, one of these being that of means of production, the other that of means of consumption. The total capital applied in each of these two branches of production forms a separate major department of the social capital. In each department, the capital has two components. 1. Variable capital. As far as its value goes, this is equal to the value of the social labor applied in this branch of production, i.e., the sum of the wages paid for it. Considered in its material aspect, it consists of self-acting labor power itself, i.e., of living labor set in motion by this capital value. 2. Constant capital. This is the value of all the means of production applied to production in this branch. It breaks down in turn into fixed capital, machines, instruments of labor, buildings, draft animals, etc., and circulating constant capital, materials of production such as raw and ancillary materials, semi-finished goods, etc. The value of the total annual product created in each of these two departments with the aid of this capital breaks down into a component that represents the constant capital C consumed in its production, only its value being transferred to the product, and the portion of value that is added by the overall annual labor. This last breaks down again into the replacement of the variable capital V advanced and the excess over it that forms the surplus value S. Just as with the value of any individual commodity, so that of the annual total product of each department also breaks down into C plus V plus S. The value component C, which represents the constant capital consumed in the course of production, is not the same thing as the value of the constant capital applied in production. The materials of production are certainly completely consumed, and their value is therefore entirely transferred to the product. But only a part of the fixed capital is entirely consumed, its value thereby being transferred to the product. Another part of the fixed capital in machines, buildings, etc. continues to exist and to function just as before, even if its value is diminished by the annual wear and tear. This part of the fixed capital that continues to function does not exist for us when we consider the value of the product. It forms a part of the capital value that is independent of this newly produced commodity value and is present alongside it. This was already shown when we considered the value of the product of an individual capital in Volume 1, Chapter 8, pages 311 to 12. Here, however, we must set aside for the time being the mode of consideration used there. We saw, in dealing with the product of an individual capital, how the value subtracted from the fixed capital by wear and tear is transferred to the commodity product created during the period of this depreciation, irrespective of whether or not a part of this fixed capital is replaced in kind during this period out of the transferred value. Here, however, in dealing with the total social product and its value, it is necessary to abstract at least provisionally from the portion of value transferred to the annual product during the year by the wear and tear of the fixed capital, inasmuch as this fixed capital is not replaced again in kind in the course of the year. In a later section of this chapter, Section 9, we shall discuss this point separately. For our investigation of simple reproduction, we intend to use the following schema, in which C is equal to constant capital, V is equal to variable capital, and S is equal to surplus value, and the rate of valorization, S over V, is taken to be 100%. The figures may be in millions of marks, francs, or pounds sterling. 1. Production of means of production. Capital of 4,000 C plus 1,000 V is equal to 5,000. Commodity product 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S equaling 6,000. Commodity product 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S totaling 6,000 existing in the form of means of production. 2. Production of means of consumption. Capital 2,000 C plus 500 V totaling 2,500. Commodity product 2,000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S totaling 3,000 existing in means of consumption. The total annual commodity product taken together is thus 1. 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S totaling 6,000 means of production, and 2,000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S totaling 3,000 means of consumption. The total value is 9,000, the fixed capital that continues to function in its natural form being excluded by our assumption. If we now investigate the transactions necessary on the basis of simple reproduction, i.e., where the whole surplus value is unproductively consumed, and ignore in the first instance the monetary circulation that mediates these, we gain from the outset 3 important clues towards further developments. 1. The 500 V of workers' wages in Department 2 and the 500 S surplus value of the capitalists in the same department must be spent on means of consumption, but their value exists in the means of consumption to a value of 1,000 that restore to the capitalists of Department 2 the 500 V they advanced, and represent besides this their 500 S. The wages and surplus value in Department 2 are thus converted within Department 2 into the product of Department 2, 500 V plus 500 S. Department 2, being 1,000 in means of consumption, thereby drops out of the total product. 2. The 1,000 V plus 1,000 S in Department 1 must likewise be spent on means of consumption, i.e. on the products of Department 2. It must therefore be exchanged for the remaining part of this product, representing constant capital to the equal amount of 2,000 C. Department 2 receives for this an equal sum in means of production, the product of Department 1, which embodies the value of 1,000 V plus 1,000 S in Department 1. In this way, 2,000 C of Department 2 and 1,000 V plus 1,000 S of Department 1 drop out of the account. 3. There still remains 4,000 C of Department 1. This consists of means of production that can only be used in Department 1 and serve to replace the constant capital consumed there. They are therefore disposed of by mutual exchange among the individual capitalists of Department 1, just as the 500 V plus 500 S of Department 2 is disposed of by exchange between workers and capitalists or between individual capitalists in Department 2. This is simply temporary for the better understanding of what follows. Section 3. Exchange between the two departments. Department 1's V plus S against Department 2's C. We begin with the major exchange relation between the two departments. 1,000 V plus 1,000 S belonging to Department 1, values that exist in the hands of their producers in the natural form of means of production, are exchanged for 2,000 C from Department 2, values that exist in the natural form of means of consumption. The capitalist class in Department 2 thereby converts its constant capital of 2,000 from the form of means of consumption back into that of means of production for these means of consumption, into a form in which it can function afresh as a factor of the labor process and as a constant capital value for the process of valorization. On the other hand, the equivalent for labor power in Department 1, 1,000 V, and for the surplus value of the capitalists in this department, being 1,000 S, is thereby realized in means of consumption. Both of these are converted from their natural form of means of production into a natural form in which they can be consumed as revenue. This mutual exchange is brought about by a money circulation, which both mediates it and makes it harder to comprehend, even though it is of decisive importance, since the component of variable capital must always reappear in the money form, as money capital which is converted from the money form into labor power. Variable capital must be advanced in the money form and all the branches of production simultaneously pursued alongside one another across the entire surface of the society, irrespective of whether these belong to Departments 1 or 2. The capitalist buys labor power before it enters the production process, but pays for it only at a prearranged date, after it has already been spent in the production of use values. Just like the remaining portion of the product's value, so the part of this that is simply an equivalent for the money spent in payment for labor power, the value portion of the product that represents the variable capital value, also belongs to the capitalist. In this particular portion of value, the worker has supplied the capitalist with the equivalent for his wage. However, it is the transformation of the commodity back into money, its sale, that again restores to the capitalist his variable capital as money capital, which he can advance once more in order to purchase labor power. In Department 1, the collective capitalist has already paid the workers £1,000, i.e. 1,000 V. I say pounds simply to denote that this is value in the money form. For the V component to the value of a product of Department 1, i.e. of the value of means of production produced by those workers. The workers use this £1,000 to purchase means of consumption of the same value from the capitalist in Department 2, and thereby transform half of Department 2's constant capital into money. The capitalists in Department 2, for their part, use this £1,000 to buy means of production to the value of 1,000 from the capitalists in Department 1. As a result of this, the variable capital value, 1,000 V, which existed as a part of Department 1's product in the natural form of means of production, is transformed back again into money, and can now function once more in the hands of Department 1 capitalists as money capital to be converted into labor power, i.e. into the most essential element of productive capital. In this way, through the realization of one part of their commodity capital, their variable capital flows back to them in the money form. As far as money is concerned, i.e. the money needed to exchange the S component of Department 1's commodity capital for the second half of Department 2's constant capital component, it may be advanced in various ways. In actual fact, this circulation comprises countless individual purchases and sales by individual capitalists in the two departments, and the money for this must in all circumstances originate from these capitalists, since we have already accounted for the money cast into circulation by the workers. At one time, a capitalist in Category 2 may use the money capital that he has alongside his productive capital to purchase means of production from the capitalists of Category 1, while on another occasion a capitalist from Category 1 may buy means of consumption from the capitalists of Category 2, with the part of his money fund that is earmarked for personal expenses, rather than for capital expenditure. As we have already shown in Parts 1 and 2, certain reserves of money, whether for capital advance or for expenditure of revenue, must always be taken as present in the hands of the capitalists alongside their productive capital. Let us assume that half the money is advanced by the capitalists in Department 2 on the purchase of means of production to replace their constant capital, the other half spent by the capitalists in Department 1 on consumption. The proportions are quite immaterial for our present purpose. Then Department 2 advances £500 and uses this to purchase £1,000 coming from Department 1's workers. It has replaced 3/4 of its constant capital in kind. Department 1 uses the £500 received in this way to buy means of consumption from Department 2, so that half of that part of its commodity capital that consists of S has gone through the circulation C to M to C, and this, its product, has been realized in a consumption fund. By this second process, the £500 returns to the hands of the Department 2 capitalists as money capital, which Department 2 possesses alongside its productive capital. On the other hand, Department 1 anticipates the sale of half the part of its commodity capital that is still in store as a product, with a money expenditure to the sum of £500 for the purchase of means of consumption from Department 2. The same £500 enables Department 2 to buy further means of production from Department 1 and thereby replace its entire constant capital, being 1,000 plus 500 plus 500, being 2,000, in kind, while Department 1 has realized its entire surplus value in means of consumption. All in all, an exchange of commodities amounting to £4,000 has taken place, with a monetary circulation of £2,000, this latter sum only being as high as it is because the entire annual product is depicted as having been exchanged all at once in a few large amounts. All that is important here is the fact that Department 2 does not only convert the constant capital, reproduced by it in the form of means of consumption, back into the form of means of production, But on top of this, the £500 that it advances to the circulation sphere to acquire means of production returns to it. In the same way, Department 1 not only recovers possession of its variable capital, which it reproduced in the form of means of production, in the money form, as money capital which is directly convertible back into labor power, but besides this, the £500 that it spent before the sale of the surplus value part of its capital, on purchasing means of consumption in anticipation, also flows back to it. However, it does not flow back through this actual expenditure, but rather through the subsequent sale of the part of its commodity product that bears half its surplus value. In these two cases, not only is it the constant capital of Department 2 converted from the product form back into the natural form of means of production, in which it alone can function as capital, and similarly, not only is the variable component of capital in Department 1 converted into the money form, and the surplus value part of the means of production in Department 1 converted into a form consumable as revenue. Besides all this, the £500 of money capital that Department 2 advanced on the purchase of means of production, before it had sold the compensating part of the value of its constant capital, present in the form of means of consumption, flows back to it, and there flows back to Department 1 the £500 that it had spent in anticipation on the purchase of means of consumption. If the money that Department 2 advanced on the account of the constant part of its commodity product, and Department 1 on the account of a part of the surplus value in its commodity product flows back to them, this is simply because the one class of capital is cast into circulation, besides its constant capital existing in the commodity form of Department 2, £500 in money, and the other class £500 over and above its surplus value existing in the commodity form of Department 1. Ultimately, the two departments pay one another fully by the exchange of their respective commodity equivalents. The money that they cast into circulation over and above the total value of their commodities, as a means for exchanging these commodities, returns to each of them from the circulation sphere to the exact amount that each of the two cast into it. Neither has become a farthing richer from all this. Department 2 had a constant capital of $2,000 in the form of means of consumption and $500 in money. It now has $2,000 in the form of means of production and $500 in money, as before. Similarly, Department 1 has, as before, a surplus value of $1,000, now transformed from its own commodities, means of production into a consumption fund, and $500 in money. The general conclusion that follows, as far as concerns the money that the individual capitalists cast into circulation to mediate their own commodity circulation, is that whether this is advanced on the account of the constant value portion of their commodities, or on the account of the surplus value existing in these commodities, insofar as it is spent as revenue, the same amount flows back to the respective capitalists as they themselves advanced for the monetary circulation. As far as the retransformation of Department 1's variable capital into the money form is concerned, this exists for the capitalists in Department 1 after they have laid it out on wages, firstly in the commodity form, in which their workers have supplied it to them. They have paid it out to the workers in the money form as the price of their labor power. They have in this way paid out the value component of their commodity product that is equal to the variable capital laid out in money. This is why they are also the owners of this part of the commodity product. But the section of the working class that they employ is not the buyer of the means of production they have themselves produced. The variable capital advanced in money for the payment of labor power thus does not directly return to the capitalists of Department 1. It is transferred by the purchases of the workers into the hands of the capitalist producers of the commodities needed by and generally accessible to the working class milieu, i.e. into the hands of the capitalists of Department 2, and it is only by this detour, by being first employed by these for the purchase of means of production, that it returns to the hands of the Department 1 capitalists. The result of all this is that in the case of simple reproduction, the value components V plus S of the commodity capital in Department 1, and therefore a corresponding proportionate part of Department 1's total commodity product, must be equal to the constant capital 2C, similarly precipitated out by Department 2 as a proportionate part of its total commodity product. In other words, Department 1's V plus S is equal to Department 2's C. Section 4. Exchange within Department 2. Necessary means of subsistence and luxury items. Of the value of the commodity product in Department 2, we still have to investigate the components V plus S. This does not bear on the most important question we are dealing with here, the extent to which the breakdown of the value of each individual capitalist commodity product into C plus V plus S holds also for the value of the total annual product, even if mediated by a different form of appearance. That question is resolved by the exchange of Department 1's V plus S against Department 2's C. On the other hand, and by the reproduction of Department 1's C in the annual commodity product of Department 1 on the other, that question is resolved by the exchange of Department 1's V plus S against Department 2's C on the one hand, and by the reproduction of Department 1C in the annual commodity product of Department 1 on the other, something that will be left for later investigation. See Section 6 below. Since Department 2's V plus S exists in the natural form of items of consumption, since the variable capital advanced to the workers in payment for labor power must be spent by them by and large on means of consumption, and since, on the supposition of simple reproduction, the S component of commodity values is also spent as revenue on means of consumption, it is evident at first glance that the workers in Department 2 use the wages received from the Department 2 capitalists to buy back a part of their own product, a part corresponding in extent to the money value they received as wages. In this way, the capitalist class of Department 2 retransform the money capital they have advanced in payment for labor power into the money form. It is just as if they have paid the workers in mere tokens of value. As soon as the workers realize such tokens by purchasing a part of the commodity product produced by them and belonging to the capitalists, these value tokens return to the hands of the capitalists. In our case, however, the tokens not only represent value, but actually possess value in their material existence as gold or silver. We shall later investigate more closely this particular kind of reflux of the variable capital advanced in the money form, which takes place through the process in which the working class appears as buyer and the capitalist class as seller. See Section 5. What matters here is a different point which must be dealt with in discussing this reflux of the variable capital back to its starting point. Department 2 of the annual commodity production consists of the most diverse branches of industry, but as far as its products go, these may be broken down into two major subdivisions. Subdivision A, those means of consumption that enter the consumption of the working class, and insofar as they are necessary means of subsistence, also form a part of the consumption of the capitalist class, even if this part is different both in quality and value from that of the workers. This whole subdivision can be classified for our present purpose under the heading necessary means of consumption. And in this connection, it is quite immaterial whether a product such as tobacco, for example, is from the physiological point of view a necessary means of consumption or not. It suffices that it is such a means of consumption by custom. Subdivision B, luxury means of consumption, which enter the consumption only of the capitalist class, i.e. can be exchanged only for the expenditure of surplus value, which does not accrue to the workers. As far as the first category goes, it is evident that the variable capital advanced in production of the kinds of commodities pertaining to it has to flow directly back in the money form to the section of capitalists in Department 2, i.e., the capitalists in 2A, who produce these necessary means of subsistence. They sell these to their own workers to the amount of the variable capital paid the latter in wages. This reflux is a direct one for Subdivision A of the capitalist class in Department 2 as a whole, no matter how numerous may be the transactions between the capitalists and the various component branches of industry by which this reflux of variable capital is proportionately distributed. These are processes of circulation, in which the means of circulation are directly supplied by the money spent by the workers. It is different, however, with Subdivision 2B. The component of the value product with which we are dealing here, 2B's V plus S, exists entirely in the natural form of luxury items, i.e., items that the working class can as little buy as they can buy the commodity value of Department 1's V, existing in the form of means of production, even though these luxury items are, like the means of production, products of the workers concerned. The reflux by which the variable capital advanced in this subdivision returns to the capitalist producers in its money form cannot be a direct one, therefore, but has to be mediated in a similar way to the case of Department 1's V. Let us assume, as above, that for Department 2 as a whole, V is equal to 500 and S is equal to 500, but that the variable capital and the surplus value corresponding to it is distributed as follows. Subdivision A, necessary means of subsistence, V is equal to 400 and S is equal to 400, i.e. a quantity of commodities in the form of necessary means of consumption to the value of 400V plus 400S, totaling 800, or Subdivision 2A, 400V, 400S. Subdivision B, luxury items, to the value of 100V plus 100S, totaling 200, or Subdivision 2B, 100V, 100S. The workers in Subdivision 2B have received 100 in money in payment for their labor power, let us say £100 sterling. They use this to buy means of consumption to the sum of 100 from the capitalists in 2A. This class of capitalists then buys 100 worth of commodities to B, and in this way the variable capital of the capitalists in 2B flows back to them. The capitalists in 2A already have their 400V back in the money form as a result of the exchange with their own workers. Of the part of their product that represents surplus value, moreover, a quarter has been passed to the workers in 2B, and in exchange for this, 2b, 100v, in luxury goods have been withdrawn. If we now suppose that the capitalists in 2a and 2b divide their expenditure of revenue with the same proportions between necessary means of subsistence and luxury items, i.e., if we assume that both of them spend 3/5 of the revenue on necessary means of subsistence and 2/5 on luxuries, then this means that the capitalists in Subdivision 2a spent 3/5 of their surplus value revenue of 400s on their own products, necessary means of subsistence, i.e., 240, and 2/5, totaling 160, on luxury articles. The capitalists of Subdivision 2b divide their surplus value, totaling 100s, in a similar way. 3/5, totaling 60, on necessities, and 2/5, totaling 40, on luxuries, these latter being produced and exchanged within their own subdivision. We shall now see how the 160 of luxury items received for Subdivision 2a's S flows to the capitalists in 2a. Out of Subdivision 2a's 400s, in the form of necessary means of subsistence, we already saw how 100 was exchanged for an equal sum of 2b's v, existing in luxury articles. A further 60 has then to be exchanged for 2b's 60s in luxuries. The whole account at the start is 2a with 400v plus 400s and 2b with 100v plus 100s. 1. 400v, belonging to Subdivision A, is consumed by the workers in 2a, whose product, necessary means of subsistence, it forms part of. The workers buy this from the capitalist producers in their own subdivision. In this way, £400 in money flows back to these capitalists, the variable capital value of 400 that they paid to their own workers. This can now be used to buy labor power again. 2. A part of the 400s belonging to Subdivision A equal to the 100v in Subdivision B, i.e., 1/4 of the surplus value of A, is realized in luxury items in the following way. The workers in B receive £100 as wages from the capitalists in their own subdivision. They use this to buy 1/4 of the surplus value of A, i.e., commodities that exist in the form of necessary means of subsistence. The capitalists of A use this money to buy luxury articles to the same amount, the 100v belonging to B, i.e., half of the total luxury production. In this way, the variable capital of the capitalists in B flows back to them in the money form, and they are able to begin their reproduction afresh by renewing the purchase of labor power, since the total constant capital of the entire Department 2 has already been converted by the exchange of Subdivision 1's V plus S for Subdivision 2's C. Thus, the luxury workers can sell their labor power once again only because the part of their own product that they created as an equivalent for their wages has been drawn by the capitalist 2A into their consumption fund, turned into cash. The same applies to the sale of labor power in Department 1, since Department 2's C, against which Department 1's V plus S is exchanged, consists of both luxury goods and necessary means of subsistence, while what is renewed by Department 1's V plus S are the means of production both for luxury goods and for necessary means of subsistence. 3. We come now to that exchange between A and B, which is simply an exchange between the capitalists of the two subdivisions. We have already disposed of the variable capital 400V and a part of the surplus value 100S in A, as well as of the variable capital 100V in B. We further assumed that the capitalists in both cases divide their expenditure of revenue in the average ratio of 2/5 for luxuries and 3/5 for necessary provisions. Besides the 100 paid out for luxuries, which has already been spent, Subdivision A as a whole still has a further 60 for luxuries to come, and in the same ratio, B has a total of 40. Subdivision 2A's S is therefore divided into 240 for means of subsistence and 160 for luxuries, 240 plus 160 totaling 400S belonging to Subdivision A. Subdivision B's S is divided into 60 for means of subsistence and 40 for luxuries, 60 and 40 being 100S belonging to Subdivision 2B. The latter 40 is consumed by this class out of their own product, 2/5 of their surplus value, the 60 for means of subsistence they receive by exchanging 60 of their own surplus product for 60S belonging to Subdivision A. We have, therefore, the following equations for the capitalist class of Department 2, seen as a whole, where V plus S exists for Subdivision A in necessary means of subsistence and for B in luxury articles. Subdivision 2A's 400V plus 400S plus Subdivision 2B's 100V plus 100S is equal to 1000. Through the above described movement, 500V of A plus B is realized in 400V of A and 100S of A, and 500S of A plus B is realized in 300S of A plus 100V of B plus 100S of B, a total of 1000. For A and B, each considered by itself, we obtain the realizations A, V over 400V belonging to A, plus S over 240S of A plus 100V of B plus 60S of B equals 800. And B, V over 100S of A plus S over 60S of A plus 40S of B is equal to 200, and 800 and 200 equal 1000. If we stick for simplicity's sake to the same ratio between variable and constant capital in the two subdivisions, although this is in no way necessary, then we obtain for 400V of A a constant capital of 1600, and for 100V of B a constant capital of 400. The subdivisions of Department 2 are then as follows. Subdivision 2A, 1600C plus 400V plus 400S equaling 2400. Subdivision 2B, 400C plus 100V plus 100S equaling 600. Altogether, 2000C plus 500V plus 500S totaling 3000. Out of Subdivision 2's 2000C in means of consumption that are exchanged for Subdivision 1's 2000V plus S, we accordingly have 1600 exchanged for means of production of necessary means of subsistence, and 400 for means of production of luxuries. The 2000V plus S of Subdivision 1 is thus itself broken down into 800V plus 800S for A, or 1600 in means of production for necessary means of subsistence, and 200V plus 200S for B, or 400 in means of production for luxuries. An important part, not only of the means of labor proper, but also of the raw and ancillary materials, etc., is the same for both subdivisions. But as far as the exchanges of the various value components of the total product of Subdivision 1 V plus S are concerned, any division along these lines would be completely irrelevant. Both the above 800V of Subdivision 1 and 200V of Subdivision 1 are realized through the spending of wages on means of consumption 1000C of Subdivision 2, so that the money capital advanced for wages is distributed evenly on the reflux between the capitalist producers of Department 1, and proportionately covers the variable capital they advanced back again into money. On the other hand, as far as the realization of the 1000S of Subdivision 1 is concerned, here too the capitalist uniformly draws 600 from Subdivision 2A and 400 from Subdivision 2B, in means of consumption from the entire second half of Subdivision 2's constant capital, equaling 1000, in proportion to the size of their S. I.e., those who replace the constant capital of 2A draw 480, being 3/5, from 600C, product of Subdivision 2A, and 320, 2/5, from 400C of product of Subdivision 2B, totaling 800. Those who replace the constant capital of 2B draw 120, 3/5, from 600C of 2A, and 80, 2/5, from 400C of 2B, being 200, a total of 1000. What is arbitrarily chosen here for both Departments 1 and 2 is the ratio of variable capital to constant capital. Arbitrary also is the identity of this ratio between the departments and their subdivisions. This identity is assumed here only for the sake of simplification, and the assumption of different ratios would not change anything at all in the conditions of the problem or its solution. The necessary result, however, on the assumption of simple reproduction, is as follows. 1. The new value product of the year's labor that is created in the natural form of means of production, which can be broken down into V plus S, is equal to the constant capital value C in the product of the other section of the year's labor, reproduced in the form of means of consumption. If it were smaller than 2C, the Department 2 could not completely replace its constant capital. If it were larger, then an unused surplus would be left over. In both cases, the assumption of simple reproduction would be destroyed. 2. In the annual product reproduced in the form of means of consumption, the variable capital V, advanced in the money form, can be realized only by those of its recipients who are workers in the luxury trades in the part of necessary means of subsistence that at first sight embodies surplus value for its capitalist producers, i.e., the V that is laid out on luxury production is equal to a part of S corresponding to it in value, which is produced in the form of necessary means of subsistence, and must thus be smaller than the total S, 2AS that is, and it is only by realizing this V in part of S that the variable capital advanced by the capitalist producers of luxury articles returns to them in the money form. This is a phenomena quite analogous to the realization of Subdivision 1's V plus S and 2C, only that in the second case, Subdivision 2B's V is realized in a part of Subdivision 2A's S equal to it in value. These ratios remain qualitatively decisive in every distribution of the annual social product, inasmuch as this actually goes into the process of annual reproduction mediated by circulation. Subdivision 1's V plus S can be realized only in Subdivision 2's C, just as Subdivision 2C can be realized only in its function as a component of the productive capital by way of this realization. Subdivision 2B's V, similarly, can be realized only in a part of Subdivision 2A's S, and only in this way can Subdivision 2B's V be transformed back into its form as money capital. It goes without saying that this applies only to the extent that all this is really a result of the reproduction process itself, i.e. inasmuch as the capitalists in 2B do not, for instance, obtain their V on credit from another source. Quantitatively, however, the exchange between the various parts of the annual product only takes place in the proportionate way depicted above to the extent that the scale of production and the value ratios involved in it remain constant, and these fixed ratios are not altered by foreign trade. If it is now said, in the manner of Adam Smith, that Subdivision 1's V plus S is resolved into Subdivision 2C, and Subdivision 2C resolved into Subdivision 1's V plus S, or alternatively, as he often and still more absurdly likes to say, Subdivision 1's V plus S form components of the price, or as he says, value in exchange, of Subdivision 2's C, and Subdivision 2's C forms the entire component of the value of Subdivision 1's V plus S, then one could say, and one would in fact have to say as well, that Subdivision 2B's V can be resolved into Subdivision 2A's S, or Subdivision 2A's S into Subdivision 2B's V, or that 2B's V forms a component of the surplus value of 2A, and vice versa. In this way, the surplus value would be resolved into wages, or variable capital, and this variable capital would form a component of the surplus value. This piece of absurdity is actually to be found in Smith, inasmuch as he sees wages as determined by the value of necessary means of subsistence, and these commodity values as determined in turn by the value of the wages, variable capital, and surplus value contained in them. He is so absorbed in the fractions into which the value product of a working day breaks down on the capitalist basis, i.e. into V plus S, that he completely forgets that it is quite immaterial, in simple commodity exchange, whether the equivalents that exist in various natural forms consist of paid or unpaid labor, since in both cases they need the same amount of labor for their production, and that it is equally immaterial whether A's commodity is a means of production and B's a means of consumption, whether after its sale the one commodity has to function as a component of capital and the other to go into the consumption fund and be, according to Adam, consumed as revenue. The use that the individual buyer makes of his commodity does not fall into the sphere of commodity exchange, of circulation, and does not affect the value of the commodity. This is in no way altered by the fact that the analysis of the circulation of the total annual social product must deal with the specific destination in terms of its use, the consumption aspect, of the different components of that product. In connection with the exchange, noted above, of 2B's V for an equal valued portion of 2A's S, and the further exchanges between 2A's S and 2B's V, it is in no way assumed, whether we are dealing with the capitalists of 2A and 2B individually or in the aggregate, that they divide their surplus value between necessary consumption and luxuries in the same ratio. One person may spend more on one kind of consumption, another person on something else. All that is presupposed on the basis of simple reproduction is that a sum of value equal to the total surplus value is realized in a consumption fund. The limits of this are thus given. Within each department, one person may spend more on A, another person more on B, though these may compensate for one another in such a way that the capitalist class both in A and B, taken as a whole, share in each the same proportion. The value relations, however, the proportionate shares in the total value of the products of Department 2 for the two kinds of producers, A and B, and therefore also a definite quantitative ratio between the branches of production that supply those products, are necessarily given in each concrete case. It is only the ratio taken by way of example that is hypothetical. If a different one is taken, then this in no way alters the qualitative aspects. It is only the quantitative determinations that change. If any circumstances lead to a change in the proportionate magnitudes of A and B, then the conditions of simple reproduction alter accordingly. Since 2B's V is realized in an equivalent portion of 2A's S, it follows that as the luxury part of the annual product grows, and a rising quota of labor power is absorbed in luxury production, the retransformation of the variable capital advanced in 2B's V into money capital that can function anew as the money form of variable capital, and with it the existence and reproduction of the part of the working class engaged in 2B, their supply of necessary means of consumption, is conditioned by the prodigality of the capitalist class, the conversion of a significant part of their surplus value into luxury items. Every crisis temporarily decreases luxury consumption. It delays and slows down the retransformation of 2B's V into money capital, so that only a partial transformation is possible and a section of the luxury workers are thrown onto the streets. This leads in turn to a stagnation and restriction in the scale of necessary means of consumption. And this quite apart from the unproductive workers who are discharged at the same time, workers who receive for their service a part of the luxury expenditure of the capitalists, they are themselves to this extent a luxury item, and who also participate very substantially in the consumption of necessary means of subsistence, etc. The reverse is the case in periods of prosperity, and particularly during the phase of hyperactivity, when the relative value of money, as expressed in commodities, already falls for other reasons, without a real revolution in values taking place, and so the prices of commodities rise independently of their own value. It is then not only the consumption of necessary means of subsistence that rises. The working class, in which the entire reserve army of labor has now been enrolled, also takes a temporary share in the consumption of luxury articles that are otherwise, for the most part, necessary only for the capitalists. This phenomenon also provokes a rise in prices. It is a pure tautology to say that crises are provoked by a lack of effective demand or effective consumption. The capitalist system does not recognize any forms of consumer other than those who can pay, if we exclude the consumption of paupers and swindlers. The fact that commodities are unsaleable means no more than that no effective buyers have been found for them, i.e., no consumers, no matter whether the commodities are ultimately sold to meet the needs of productive or individual consumption. If the attempt is made to give this tautology the semblance of greater profundity by the statement that the working class receives too small a portion of its own product and that the evil would be remedied if it received a bigger share, i.e. if its wages rose, we need only note that crises are always prepared by a period in which wages generally rise, and the working class actually does receive a greater share in the part of the annual product destined for consumption. From the standpoint of these advocates of sound and simple common sense, such periods should rather avert the crisis. It thus appears that capitalist production involves certain conditions independent of people's good or bad intentions, which permit the relative prosperity of the working class only temporarily, and moreover, always as a harbinger of crisis. We saw just now how the proportional relation between the production of necessary items of consumption and the production of luxuries gives rise to the division of Subdivision 2's V plus S into Subdivision 2A and Subdivision 2B, and so also of 2's constant capital into Subdivision 2A's constant capital and Subdivision 2B's constant capital. It thereby affects the character and the quantitative ratios of production right at the roots and is an essential determining factor of their overall pattern. Simple reproduction is oriented by nature to consumption as its aim. Even though the squeezing out of surplus value appears as the driving motive of the individual capitalist, this surplus value, no matter what its proportionate size, can be used here in the last analysis only for his individual consumption. Insofar as simple reproduction is also part of any annual reproduction on an expanded scale, and the major part at that, this motive remains alongside the motive of enrichment as such, and in opposition to it. In the real world, the matter appears more intricate, since the partners who share the loot, the surplus value of the capitalist, figure independently of him as consumers. Section 5. The mediation of the exchange by monetary circulation. As we have analyzed it up to the present, circulation takes place between the different categories of producer according to the following schema. 1. Between departments 1 and 2. 1. 4000C plus 1000V plus 1000S over 2. 2000C plus 500V plus 500S. This disposes of the circulation of Subdivision 2's constant capital, being 2000, which is exchanged for Subdivision 1's V plus S, 1000 plus 1000. There remains the circulation of V plus S within Department 2. We leave aside for the time being the 4000C belonging to Department 1. This Department 2 V plus S is divided between the subdivisions 2A and 2B as follows. Department 2, 500V plus 500S equals A, being 400V plus 400S, plus B, 100V plus 100S. The 400V of Subdivision 2A circulates within its own subdivision. The workers paid with it use it to buy necessary means of subsistence that they have themselves produced from their employers, the capitalists in 2A. Since the capitalists of both subdivisions spend their surplus value 3/5 on products of 2A, necessary means of subsistence, and 2/5 on products of 2B, luxuries, 3/5 the surplus value of A, i.e. 240, is consumed within the subdivision 2A itself. Similarly, 2/5 of the surplus value in B, which was produced and is present in luxuries, is consumed within subdivision 2B. There still remains to be exchanged between 2A and 2B, on the part of 2A, 160S, and on the part of 2b, 100v plus 60s. These cancel each other out. With the 100 they receive in money as wages, the workers in 2b buy necessary means of subsistence from 2a. The capitalists in 2a thereby receive the money they require in order to invest 2/5 of their surplus value, being 160s, in the luxuries produced by 2b, 100v that remains in the hands of the capitalists of 2b as the product replacing the wages they paid, and 60s. The schema for this is thus: 2a, 400v plus 240s, in parentheses, plus 160s, over 100v plus 60s plus 40s in parentheses, where the items in parentheses are those that circulate and are consumed only within their own subdivision. The direct reflux of the money capital advanced in variable capital, which takes place for the capitalists only in subdivision 2a producing necessary means of subsistence, is simply a manifestation, modified by special conditions, of the general law already explained, that the money that commodity producers advance returns to them in the normal course of commodity circulation. What also follows from this, incidentally, is that wherever there is a money capitalist behind the commodity producers, and it is he who first advances the money capital to the industrial capitalist, money capital in the strict sense of the word, i.e. capital value in the money form, the actual point of return of this money is the pocket of the money capitalist. In this way, even if the money circulates through the hands of more or less all concerned, the mass of the circulating money belongs to the department of money capital organized and concentrated in the form of banks, etc. The way in which this department advances its capital determines that the final reflux in the money form is always to it, even if this is mediated by the transformation of the industrial capital back into the money capital. Two things are always required for commodity circulation. Commodities have to be cast into circulation, and so is money. Quote from Volume 1, Chapter 3, page 208. The process of circulation, therefore, unlike the direct exchange of products, does not disappear from view once the use values have changed places and changed hands. The money does not vanish when it finally drops out of the series of metamorphoses undergone by a commodity. It always leaves behind a precipitate at a point in the arena of circulation vacated by the commodities. End quote. In the circulation between Department 2's constant capital and Department 1's variable capital and surplus value, for example, we assumed that £500 sterling was advanced for this circulation by Department 2. In the countless circulation processes which the circulation between major social groups of producers is resolved into, it is now one of this group and now one of that who first appears as a buyer and casts money into circulation. Quite apart from individual circumstances, this is already determined by the difference in the production periods and hence the turnovers of the various commodity capitals. Department 2 uses £500 to buy means of production to this amount from Department 1, but the latter uses the £500 to buy means of consumption from 2. The money simply flows back to Department 2, which is not made any richer by this reflux. Department 1 first cast £500 into circulation in money and withdrew commodities to the same value. It then sold commodities for £500 and extracted from circulation the same amount in money. In this way, the £500 flows back. In point of fact, Department 2 has cast into circulation £500 in money and £500 in commodities, a total of £1,000. It withdraws from circulation £500 of commodities and £500 of money. The circulation sphere needs only £500 in money for the conversion of both £500 in commodities, of Department 1, and £500 in commodities of Department 2. So whoever advanced the money for the purchase of someone else's commodity receives it back again in the sale of his own. If it had been Department 1 that first bought commodities worth £500 from Department 2 and later sold £500 of commodities to Department 2, this £500 would return to Department 1 instead of to Department 2. In Department 1, the money invested in wages, i.e. advanced as variable capital in the money form, does not return directly in this form, but indirectly by a detour. In Department 2, on the other hand, the £500 for wages returns directly from the workers to the capitalists, since this reflux is always direct, where sale and purchase are repeated between the same persons in such a way that they regularly face one another alternately as buyer and seller of commodities. The capitalist in Department 2 pays for his labor power in money. He thereby incorporates the labor power into his own capital, and it is only by this process of circulation, which for him is simply the transformation of money capital into productive capital, that he, as industrial capitalist, confronts the worker as his wage laborer. But after this, the worker, who was in the first instance the seller, the dealer in his own labor power, now in the second instance confronts the capitalist, the seller of commodities, as the possessor of money. In this way, the money laid out by the capitalist on wages flows back to him. Insofar as the sale of these commodities does not involve swindling, etc., but equivalents are exchanged in commodities and money, this is not a process by which the capitalist can enrich himself. nor does he pay the worker twice over, first in money and then in commodities. His money returns to him when the worker exchanges it with him for commodities. The money capital transformed into variable capital, i.e., the money advanced as wages, plays a major role in actual monetary circulation. Since the working class has to live from hand to mouth, i.e., since it cannot give the industrial capitalist any long-term credit, variable capital has to be advanced at the same time in money at countless different points in society, at a definite and short intervals, such as a week, etc. These periods are repeated fairly rapidly, no matter how different the turnover period of capitals in the various branches of industry, though the shorter the intervals, the smaller need be the relative size of the total sum of money cast into circulation at one stroke through these channels. In every country of capitalist production, the money capital advanced in this way forms a relatively decisive share in the total circulation, and all the more so in that the same money flows through the most varied channels and functions as means of circulation for a myriad other businesses, before returning to its starting point. Let us now consider the circulation between Department 1's variable capital and surplus value and Department 2's constant capital from a different point of view. The capitalists in Department 1 advance £1,000 as payment for wages. The workers use this to buy £1,000 in means of subsistence from the capitalists in Department 2, and these in turn use it to buy means of production from the capitalists in Department 1. The variable capital advanced by the latter has now returned to them in its monetary form, while the capitalists in Department 2 have transformed half of their constant capital from the form of commodity capital back into productive capital. The capitalists in Department 2 advance a further £500 in money to get means of production from Department 1. The capitalists in Department 1 spend this money on means of consumption from Department 2. This £500 thus flows back to the capitalists in Department 1, who advance it afresh in order to transform the last quarter of the constant capital they previously transformed into commodities back into its productive natural form. This money again flows back to Department 1 and once more withdraws from Department 2 means of consumption to the same amount. The capitalists in Department 2 are now, as before, in possession of £500 in money and £2,000 in constant capital, although this has been newly converted from the form of commodity capital back into that of productive capital. With £1,500 in money, a commodity mass of £5,000 has been circulated. To recapitulate: 1. Department 1 pays its workers £1,000 for labor power of the same value. 2. These workers use this £1,000 to buy means of subsistence from Department 2. 3. Department 2 buys means of production with the same money from Department 1, thereby restoring Department 1's variable capital in its money form. 4. Department 2 uses £500 to buy means of production from Department 1. 5. Department 1 buys means of consumption from Department 1 with the same £500. 6. Department 2 buys means of production from Department 1 with this £500. 7. Department 1 buys means of consumption from Department 2 with the £500. As a result, the £500 which Department 2 cast into circulation, on top of its £2,000 in commodities, and for which did not withdraw any equivalent in commodities, has flowed back to it. The exchange process thus takes the following course. 1. Department 1 pays £1,000 for labor power, i.e. for a commodity of £1,000. 2. Its workers use their wages to buy means of consumption from Department 2 to the amount of £1,000, i.e. commodities of £1,000. 3. With the £1,000 received from these workers, Department 2 buys means of production to the same value from Department 1, i.e. commodities of £1,000. With this, £1,000 in money, as the money form of the variable capital, has flowed back to Department 1. 4. Department 2 buys means of production from Department 1 for £500, i.e. commodities of £500. 5. Department 1 uses the same £500 to buy means of consumption from Department 2, i.e. commodities of £500. 6. Department 2 uses the £500 to buy means of production from Department 1, i.e. commodities of £500. 7. Department 1 uses the £500 to buy means of consumption from Department 2, i.e. commodities of £500. The sum of the commodity values exchanged is £5,000. The £500 that Department 2 advanced for its purchases has returned to it. As a result, 1. Department 1 possesses variable capital in the money form to the sum of £1,000, which is what it originally advanced to the circulation sphere. It has also spent £1,000 on individual consumption from its own commodity product, i.e. it has spent the money that it received for the sale of means of production, amounting to the total of £1,000. On the other hand, the natural form into which the variable capital existing in the money form has to be converted, i.e. labor power, has to be maintained, reproduced by consumption, and be present once again as the only article of trade of its proprietors, who have to sell this if they want to live. In this way, the relationship between wage laborers and capitalists is also reproduced. 2. The constant capital of Department 2 is replaced in kind, and the £500 advanced to circulation by Department 2 has returned to it. For the workers in Department 1, the circulation is the simple one of C to M to C. The commodity being labor power, the money being £1,000, the money form of the variable capital in Department 1, and the second commodity being the necessary means of subsistence to the sum of £1,000. This £1,000 converts into money the same value of constant capital in Department 2, existing in the commodity form as means of subsistence. For the capitalists in Department 2, the process is C to M, the transformation of a part of their commodity product into the money form, from which it is transformed back into components of their productive capital, i.e. into a part of the means of production that they need. In the advance of M, £500, which the capitalists in Department 2 make in order to purchase the remaining components of their means of production, they anticipate the money form of their constant capital that is still in the commodity form, means of consumption. In the act M to C, in which Department 2 buys with M and Department 1 sells C, Department 2's money is transformed into a part of its productive capital, while Department 1's commodity undergoes the act C to M and is transformed into money, although it does not represent any component of capital value, but rather realized surplus value which is simply spent on means of consumption. In the circulation M to C, to P, to C prime to M prime, the first act, M to C, of one capitalist is the final act, C prime to M prime, of another, or part of it. It is completely immaterial for the commodity circulation itself whether this C, by which M is transformed into productive capital, represents for its seller, who thereby converts this C into money, the constant component of his capital, the variable component, or surplus value. As far as the Department 1 capitalists are concerned, with respect to the component V plus S of their commodity product, they withdraw more money from the circulation sphere than they cast into it. Firstly, their £1,000 of variable capital returns to them. Secondly, they sell means of production for £500. See above, exchange number 4. And this enables them to convert half their surplus value into cash. Then they again sell a further £500 of means of production, exchange number 6, the second half of their surplus value, and as a result, their entire surplus value has been withdrawn from circulation in the money form. We have, therefore, in succession, 1. Variable capital transformed back into money, £1,000. 2. Half of the surplus value realized, £500, the other half of the surplus value, £500, a total realized of 1,000 V plus 1,000 S equaling £2,000. Even if Department 1 cast only £1,000 into circulation, we leave aside here the circumstances that mediate the reproduction of Department 1's constant capital, which will be considered later, it is withdrawn twice the amount. Of course, the S that has been realized, transformed into money, immediately vanishes again into someone else's hands, that is Department 2, because the money is exchanged for means of consumption. The capitalists of Department 1 have withdrawn only as much in money as they cast in commodities. The fact that this value is surplus value and costs the capitalist nothing in no way alters the value of the commodities themselves. It is therefore completely immaterial as far as the exchange of values in commodity circulation is concerned. The realization of the surplus value in money is naturally temporary, just like all other forms that the capital advanced passes through in its conversions. It lasts only so long as the interval between the transformation of Department 1's commodities into money and the subsequent transformation of Department 1's money into Department 2's commodities. If the turnovers are assumed to be shorter, or from the standpoint of simple commodity circulation, the velocity of monetary circulation is assumed to be greater, then still less money would be needed in order to circulate the commodity values to be exchanged. This sum is always determined, once the number of successive exchanges is given, by the sum of the prices or values of the circulating commodities. The proportion in which this sum of values consists of surplus value on the one hand and capital value on the other is completely irrelevant here. Say that in our example, wages are paid 4 times a year in Department 1. 4 times 250 equals 1,000, and so £250 in money would be sufficient for the circulation of Department 1's variable capital in exchange for half of Department 2's constant capital, and for the circulation between the variable capital of Department 1 and the labor power of Department 1. In the same way, if the circulation between Department 1's surplus value and Department 2's constant capital consisted of 4 turnovers, then £250 would be sufficient for it, and therefore a total sum of money, or money capital of £500, would be enough for the circulation of commodities to the sum of £5,000. A quarter of the surplus value would then be realized 4 times a year, instead of half of it twice. If in exchange number 4, it was Department 1 instead of Department 2 that appeared as the buyer, i.e. £500 in money was spent on means of consumption to the same value, Department 2 would then buy means of production with the same £500 in exchange number 5. In exchange number 6, Department 1 would use this £500 to buy means of consumption, and in number 7, Department 2 would use it again to buy means of production. Thus, the £500 would ultimately return to Department 1 instead of Department 2 as before. The surplus value is realized here by the money spent by its capitalist producers themselves on their private consumption, which represents anticipated revenue, anticipated income from the surplus value contained in the commodities still to be sold. The realization of surplus value does not take place through the reflux of the £500. For alongside the £1,000 in the commodities to Department 1's variable capital, Department 1 has cast £500 of money into circulation in connection with exchange number 4, and this was an additional sum, not, as far as we know, the proceeds of their sale of the commodities. When this money flows back to Department 1 has simply recovered its additional money and not realized its surplus value. The monetary realization of Department 1's surplus value simply involves the sale of the commodities in which it is contained, and each time it lasts only as long as the money released by the sale of these commodities is not spent again on means of consumption. Department 1 uses its additional money, £500, to buy means of consumption from Department 2. This money is spent by Department 1, which gets the equivalent for it in commodities from Department 2. The money flows back the first time through the purchase by Department 2 of £500 of commodities from Department 1. It flows back, therefore, as the equivalent for the commodities sold by Department 1, but these commodities cost Department 1 nothing. They are part of its surplus value, so that it is the money that Department 1 itself cast into circulation that realizes its own surplus value. Similarly, on its second purchase, exchange number 6, Department 1 again receives its equivalent in commodities from Department 2. Suppose that Department 2 does not buy means of production from Department 1 in exchange number 7. Then Department 1 would in fact have paid £1,000 for means of consumption and consumed its entire surplus value as revenue, i.e. paid £500 in its own commodities, means of production, and £500 in money. It would still have £500 of its own commodities, means of production, in stock on the other hand, but would have got rid of its £500 of money. Department 2, on the contrary, would have transformed 3/4 of its constant capital from the form of commodity capital back into productive capital, but it would have 1/4 left in the form of money capital, £500. This being in fact idle money, or money whose functioning has been interrupted and which is held in abeyance. If this situation lasts too long, the Department 2 would have to reduce the scale of its reproduction by 1/4. However, the £500 in means of production which Department 1 is still saddled with is not surplus value in the commodity form. It is there in place of the £500 advanced in money, which Department 1 possessed alongside its surplus value of £1,000 in the commodity form. As money, this exists in an ever-realizable form. In the commodity form, it is temporarily unsaleable. This much is evident, that simple reproduction, in which each element of productive capital in both Department 1 and Department 2 has to be replaced, remains possible only if the 500 golden birds return to Department 1, which first sent them flying. Once a capitalist spends his money on means of consumption, he is then done with it. It has gone the way of all flesh. Here we are still concerned only with industrial capitalists who stand as the representatives for all others. If the money flows back to him again, this can happen only insofar as he fishes it out of the circulation sphere in exchange for commodities, i.e. by way of his commodity capital. Just as the value of his total annual commodity product, his commodity capital, can be broken down into constant capital value, variable capital value, and surplus value, so too can every element of this, i.e. the value of every individual commodity. The realization of each of his individual commodities, the element of his commodity product, is therefore at the same time the realization of a certain quota of the surplus value contained in the total commodity product. It is therefore literally correct, in the present case, that the capitalist himself cast into circulation the money into which he converts his surplus value, i.e. by means of which he realizes it, and what is more, by spending this on means of consumption. What we have here, of course, are not the identical pieces of money, but rather a given quantity of hard cash equal to the money cast into circulation to cover his personal needs, or to the part of the money needed for that purpose. In practice, this occurs in two ways. If the business was started only within the current year, then it takes a good while, at best a few months, before the capitalist can spend money for his personal consumption out of his income from this actual business. He does not, on this account, suspend his consumption for a moment. He advances himself money against the surplus value that he still has to hunt out, whether this is advanced from his own pocket or from someone else's by way of credit. But this money is also a circulating medium in which he can later realize his surplus value. In the other case, where the business has already been in regular operation for some time, payments and receipts take place at different times of the year, but the capitalist's consumption, which anticipates his receipts, and the level of which is fixed as a certain proportion of his customary receipts or those estimated, still continues without interruption. With each portion of commodity sold, one part of the surplus value to be made in the year is realized. But if, out of the commodities produced in the year, no more is sold than is needed to replace the constant and variable capital contained in them, or if prices fall so that the sale of the entire annual product realizes only the capital value contained in it, then the anticipatory character of the money spent against future surplus value clearly emerges. If our capitalist goes bankrupt, then his creditors and the courts investigate whether his anticipated private spending stood in proportion to the state of his business and the customary or normal receipts of surplus value corresponding to it. In relation to the capitalist class as a whole, however, the proposition that it must itself cast into circulation the money needed to realize its surplus value, and also to circulate its capital, constant and variable, is not only far from paradoxical, it is in fact a necessary condition of the overall mechanism. For here, there are just two classes, the working class, which only disposes of its labor power, and the capitalist class, which has the monopoly of the means of social production and of money. It would rather be a paradox if instead it was the working class that initially advanced the money required to realize the surplus value contained in the commodities out of its own resources. The individual capitalist, however, effects this advance only by acting as a buyer, spending money on the purchase of means of consumption, or advancing money on the purchase of elements of his productive capital, either labor power or means of production. He only ever parts with the money in exchange for an equivalent. He advances money to circulation only in the same way that he advances commodities to it. In both cases, he acts as the starting point of their circulation. The real course of events is obscured by two circumstances. 1. The appearance of commercial capital, the primary form of which is always money, since the merchant as such does not produce any product or commodity, and of money capital, as the object of manipulation of a special kind of capitalist, in the circulation process of industrial capital. 2. The division of surplus value, which must always exist initially in the hands of the industrial capitalist, into different categories, the bearers of which appear alongside the industrial capitalist as the landlord for ground rent, the money lender for interest, etc., as well as the government and its officials, rentiers, etc. These fellows face the industrial capitalist as buyers, and to this extent realize his commodities in money. They too cast their share of money into the circulation sphere, and he receives this from them. What is always forgotten in connection with this are the sources from which they originally obtained this money and continue to obtain it. Section 6. The Constant Capital in Department 1. It still remains for us to investigate the constant capital in Department 1, 4,000. This is equal in value to the means of production consumed in the production of this mass of commodities, a value which reappears in the commodity product of Department 1. This reappearing value, which was not produced in the production process of Department 1 but entered it the year before as constant value, as the given value of its means of production, now exists in that entire part of the commodity mass of Department 1 that is not absorbed by Department 2. Moreover, the value of this commodity mass remaining in the hands of Department 1 capitalists is 2/3 of the value of their entire annual commodity product. If we were dealing with the individual capitalist producing one particular means of production, we could say he first sold his commodity product, transformed it into money. By transforming it into money, he also transformed the constant value component of his product back into money. With this value portion transformed into money, he then bought his means of production again from other commodity sellers, or transformed the constant capital component of his product into a natural form in which it could once more function as productive constant capital. Now, however, this assumption becomes untenable. The capitalist class in Department 1 comprises the totality of capitalists who produce means of production. Moreover, the commodity product of 4,000 that remains in their hands is a part of the social product that cannot be exchanged against any other, for there is no such other part of the annual product. With the exception of this 4,000, all the remainder has been disposed of. One part of it has been absorbed by the social consumption fund, and another part has to replace the constant capital of Department 2, which has already exchanged everything it has available for exchange with Department 1. The difficulty is very simply resolved when we remember that the entire commodity product of Department 1 consists in its natural form of means of production, i.e. of the material elements of constant capital itself. The same phenomenon is displayed here as previously with Department 2, only under a different aspect. In Department 2, the entire commodity product consists of means of consumption. One part of these, measured by the wages plus surplus value contained in this commodity product, can therefore be consumed by its own producers. Here in Department 1, the entire commodity product consists of means of production, buildings, machinery, containers, raw and ancillary materials, etc. One part of these, that which replaces the constant capital used up in this sphere, can therefore immediately function in its natural form once again as a component of the productive capital. Insofar as it steps into the circulation sphere, it circulates within Department 1. In Department 2, one part of the commodity product is individually consumed in kind by its own producers. In Department 1, on the other hand, a part of their product is productively consumed in kind by its own capitalist producers. In the 4,000 constant capital part of the commodity product of Department 1, there reappears the constant capital value consumed in this department, and it reappears moreover in a natural form in which it can immediately function again as productive constant capital. In Department 2, the part of the commodity product of 3,000, whose value equals wages plus surplus value, being 1,000, goes directly into the individual consumption of the capitalists and workers, while the constant capital value of this commodity product, on the other hand, being 2,000, cannot go back into the productive consumption of the capitalists in Department 2, but has to be replaced by exchange with Department 1. In Department 1, on the contrary, the part of its commodity product of 6,000, whose value is equal to the wages plus surplus value, being 2,000, does not go into the individual consumption of its producers, and it is also unable to do this, owing to its natural form. Instead, it must first be exchanged with Department 2. However, the constant portion of this product's value, 4,000, does exist in a natural form in which, taking the capitalist class of Department 1 as a whole, it can directly function again as their constant capital. In other words, the entire product of Department 1 consists of use values which by virtue of their natural form can serve only as elements of constant capital, given the capitalist mode of production. Out of this product, which has a value of 6,000, 1/3, being 2,000, therefore replaces the constant capital of Department 2, and the remaining 2/3 replace the constant capital of Department 1. The constant capital of Department 1 consists of a number of different groups of capitals, invested in various branches of production of means of production. So much in ironworks, so much in coal mines, etc. Each of these capital groups, or in other words, each of these social group capitals, is again composed of a larger or smaller number of independently functioning individual capitals. Firstly, the capital of society, for example 7,500, this may stand for millions, etc., is broken down into different capital groups. The social capital of 7,500 is broken down into particular portions, each invested in a particular branch of production. The part of the social capital value invested in each particular branch of production consists, in its natural form, partly of the means of production for each special sphere of production, partly of the labor power necessary and appropriately qualified for the industry in question, modified in various ways by the division of labor according to the specific kind of labor that it has to perform in the sphere of production in question. The part of the social capital applied in each particular branch of production consists once again of the sum of individual capitals invested and independently functioning in it. This obviously applies to both Departments 1 and 2. As far as concerns the constant capital value reappearing in Department 1 in the form of its commodity product, part of this goes back once again as means of production into the particular branch of production, or even the individual business from which it emerged as a product. For example, corn into the production of corn, coal into coal production, iron in the form of machines into iron production, etc. But to the extent that the partial products of which the constant capital value in Department 1 consists do not go directly back to their particular or individual spheres of production, they simply change their place. They go in their natural form into another sphere of production of Department 1, while the product of these other spheres of production of Department 1 replaces them in kind. These products merely experience a change of position. They all go back in again as factors that replace the constant capital in Department 1, only instead of entering one group of Department 1, they go into another. Inasmuch as there is exchange here between the individual capitalists of Department 1, this is exchange of one natural form of constant capital against another natural form of constant capital, one kind of means of production against other kinds of means of production. It is mutual exchange between the different individual constant portions of capital in Department 1. These products, inasmuch as they do not directly serve as means of production in their own branch of production, are thus displaced from their own point of production to another one, and mutually replace each other in this way. In other words, as happens similarly for surplus value in Department 2, each capitalist in Department 1 withdraws the appropriate means of production needed by him from this commodity mass in the proportion to which he is a joint owner of this constant capital of 4,000. If production were social, instead of capitalist, it is evident that these products of Department 1 would be no less constantly redistributed among the branches of production in this department as means of production according to the needs of reproduction. One part directly remaining in the sphere of production from which it emerged as a product, another part being shifted to other points of production, and so there would be a constant to and fro between the various points of production in this department. Section 7. Variable capital and surplus value in the two departments. The total value of the means of consumption annually produced is equal to the variable capital value reproduced in the course of the year plus the surplus value newly produced in Department 2, i.e. the value actually produced during the year, Department 2, together with the variable capital value reproduced in the year and the surplus value newly produced in Department 1, i.e. the value produced during the year in Department 1. On the premise of simple reproduction, therefore, the total value of the means of consumption annually produced is equal to the annual valuable product, i.e. equal to the total value produced by the labor of the society in the course of the year, and the reason why this must be the case is that with simple reproduction, this entire value is consumed. The total social working day breaks down into two parts. 1. Necessary labor. This creates a value of 1,500 V in the course of the year. 2. Surplus labor. This creates an additional value, or surplus value, of 1,500 S. The sum of these values is 3,000, equal to that of the means of consumption annually produced. The total value of the means of consumption produced during the year is therefore equal to the total value that the entire social working day produces during the year, i.e. equal to the value of the social variable capital plus the social surplus value, or equal to the total new annual product. We know, however, that even if these two value magnitudes are equal, this in no way means that the total value of the commodities in Department 2, the means of consumption, has been produced in this department of social production. They are equal because the constant capital value that reappears in Department 2 is equal to the value newly produced in Department 1, variable capital value plus surplus value. Hence, Department 1's V plus S can purchase the part of the product that represents constant capital value for its producers in Department 2. This explains why, even though, for the capitalists in Department 2, the value of their product breaks down into C plus V plus S, considered from the social point of view, the value of this product can be broken down into V plus S. This is the case, in fact, only because Department 2's constant capital is equal here to Department 1's V plus S, and these two components of the social product exchange their natural forms with one another by way of their commodity exchange. After this conversion, therefore, Department 2's constant capital exists once again in means of production, and Department 1's variable capital and surplus value in means of consumption. It is this circumstance that led Adam Smith to maintain that the value of the annual product resolves itself into V plus S. This, 1, applies only to the part of the annual product consisting of means of consumption, and 2, does not apply in the sense that this total value is produced in Department 2, and the value of the product is therefore the variable capital value advanced in Department 2 plus the surplus value produced in this department. It holds rather in the sense that Department 2's C plus V plus S is equal to Department 2's V plus S plus Department 1's V plus S, or because Department 2's C is equal to Department 1's V plus S. It also follows that even if the social working day, i.e. the labor spent by the entire working class over a whole year, just like each individual working day, can be simply broken down into two parts, i.e. into necessary labor plus surplus labor, and even though the value produced by this working day can therefore be similarly broken down into two parts, i.e. the portion of value with which the worker buys his own means of reproduction and the surplus value that the capitalist can spend for his individual consumption, yet, from the social standpoint, one part of the social working day is spent exclusively on the production of fresh constant capital, i.e. of products that are exclusively destined to function in the labor process as means of production, and therefore as constant capital in the accompanying process of valorization. On our assumption, the total social working day is represented by a money value of 3,000, of which 1/3, being 1,000, is produced in Department 2, which produces means of consumption, i.e. the commodities in which the entire variable capital value and the entire surplus value of the society is ultimately realized. On this supposition, therefore, 2/3 of the social working day is applied in the production of new constant capital. Even if, from the standpoint of the individual capitalists and workers in Department 1, this 2/3 of the social working day serves merely to produce variable capital value and surplus value, just like the other third of the social working day in Department 2, considered from the social standpoint, and also from the standpoint of the use value of the product, this 2/3 of the social working day still produces only a replacement for the constant capital consumed in the process of productive consumption, or in the process of being consumed. Even taken by itself, this 2/3 of the working day, although the total value it produces for its producers is equal simply to the variable capital value plus surplus value, does not produce any use value of such a kind that either wages or surplus value could be spent on it. Its product is a means of production. The first thing to note is that no part of the social working day, whether in Department 1 or Department 2, serves to produce the value of the constant capital applied in functioning in these two great spheres of production. All that is produced here is additional value. 2,000 of Department 1's V plus S plus 1,000 of Department 2's V plus S, in addition to the constant capital value of 4,000 of Department 1's C and 2,000 of Department 2's C. The new value that has been produced in the form of means of production is not yet constant capital, it is simply destined to function as such in the future. The entire product of Department 2, means of consumption, is from the use value standpoint, i.e. concretely, considered in its natural form, the product of concrete forms of labor such as weaving, baking, etc., which have been employed in this department. It is the product of this labor inasmuch as the labor functions as the subjective element of the labor process. As far as the constant value component of this product of Department 2 is concerned, however, it simply reappears in a new use value, in a new natural form, the form of means of consumption, whereas it earlier existed in the form of means of production. Its value has been transferred by the labor process from its old natural form to its new one. But the value of this 2/3 of the value of the product, 2,000, has not been produced by Department 2 in the current year's valorization process. Just as, considered from the standpoint of the labor process, the product of Department 2 is the result of newly functioning living labor and its given presupposed means of production, labor realizing itself in these as its objective conditions, so from the standpoint of the valorization process, the value of the product, 3,000, is composed of the new value produced by the 1/3 of the social working day newly added, 500V plus 500S totaling 1,000, and a constant value in which there is objectified 2/3 of a past working day, which took place before the production process of Department 2 at present under consideration. This value component of the product of Department 2 can be represented by a portion of the product itself. It exists in a quantity of means of consumption to the value of 2,000, 2/3 of a social working day. This is the new use form in which it reappears. The exchange of one part of the means of consumption, being 2,000 of Department 2's C, for means of production from Department 1, being 1,000V plus 1,000S of Department 1, is therefore in point of fact the exchange of 2/3 of a total working day which does not form part of this year's labor but was performed prior to the current year, for 2/3 of the social working day newly added in the present year. 2/3 of this year's social working day could not both be applied in the production of constant capital and yet at the same time form variable capital value and surplus value for its own producers, if it were not exchanged with the value component of the means of consumption annually consumed that contains 2/3 of a working day performed and realized prior to the present year. This is an exchange of 2/3 of this year's working day for 2/3 of a working day spent prior to this year, an exchange between labor time of this year and labor time of a previous year. It therefore explains the riddle as to how the value product of the entire social working day can be resolved into variable capital value plus surplus value, even though the 2/3 of this working day was not spent on the production of objects in which variable capital or surplus value could be realized, but rather on the production of means of production to replace the capital used up during the current year. This is explained by the simple fact that, considered from the point of view of its value, the 2/3 of Department 2's product in which the capitalists and workers of Department 1 realized the variable capital value plus the surplus value produced by them, making 2/9 of the total value of the annual product, is the product of the 2/3 of a social working day spent before the current year. The total social product of Departments 1 and 2, means of production and means of consumption, is certainly, looked at from the point of view of its use value, its concrete, natural form, the product of this year's labor, but only insofar as this labor is considered simply as useful concrete labor, not insofar as it is viewed as the expenditure of labor power, as value-forming labor. And it is only useful, concrete labor in the sense that the means of production have been transformed into new products, the products of the current year, by the living labor added to them and operating on them. The labor of this year, however, could not have been transformed into products without means of production, i.e. means of labor and production materials, independent of it. Section 8. The constant capital in both departments. As far as concerns the value of the total product, 9,000, and the categories into which it breaks down, its analysis does not offer any greater difficulty than that of the value of the product of an individual capital. It is in fact identical with this. The annual social product, taken as a whole, contains 3 one-year social working days. The value expression of each of these working days is 3,000, so that the value expression of the total product is 3 times 3,000, being 9,000. Furthermore, of the labor time that has been spent prior to the production process of the year whose product we are analyzing, 4/3 of a working day was spent in Department 1, value product 4,000, and 2/3 of a working day in Department 2, value product 2,000. Taken together, this is 2 social working days, whose value product is 6,000. Thus, 4,000 of Department 1C plus 2,000 of Department 2C, totaling 6,000C, figures as the value of means of production, or constant capital value reappearing in the value of the overall product. Besides, out of the 1-year working day that the society has newly added, 1/3 is necessary labor, or labor that replaces the value of the variable capital of Department 1, being 1,000, and pays the price of the labor applied in this department. 1/6 of the social working day is similarly necessary labor in Department 2, to a value of 500. Thus 1,000 of Department 1's V and 500 of Department 2's V, totaling 1,500 V, The value expression of half a social working day is the value expression of that half of the total working day added in the year, which consists of necessary labor. Finally, 1/3 of the total working day, a value product of 1,000, is surplus labor in Department 1. In Department 2, this surplus labor is 1/6 of a working day, a value product of 500. Together, these make up the other half of the total working day added. Thus, the total surplus value produced is equal to 1,000 to Department 1's S plus 500 to Department 2's S, equaling 1,500 S. In other words, the constant capital component to the value of the social product, that is C, is 2 working days, spent prior to the current production process, a value expression of 6,000. The necessary labor spent during the year, being V, is half the working days spent in the year's production, a value expression of 1,500, and the surplus labor spent during the year, being S, is half of the working days spent in the year's production, a value expression of 1,500. The value product of the year's labor, V plus S, is equal to 3,000. The value of the total product, that is C plus V plus S, is equal to 9,000. Thus, the difficulty does not lie in analyzing the value of the social product itself. It arises when the value components of the social product are compared with its material components. The constant portion of value, that simply reappearing, is equal to the value of the part of the social product that consists of means of production and is embodied in this part. The new year's value product, V plus S, is equal to the value of the part of the annual product that consists of means of consumption and is embodied in this. But with exceptions that are of no consequence here, means of production and means of consumption are totally different kinds of commodities, products quite different in their natural or use form, and therefore products of totally different varieties of concrete labor. The labor that uses machines for the production of means of subsistence is quite different from the labor that makes machines. The total annual working day, whose value expression is 3,000, seems to be spent on the production of means of consumption, being 3,000 in which no portion of the constant capital value reappears, since this 3,000, being 1,500 V plus 1,500 S, is simply resolved into variable capital value plus surplus value. On the other hand, the constant capital value of 6,000 reappears in a kind of product that is completely different from the means of consumption, i.e. the means of production, while no part of the social working day seems to be spent in the production of this new product. The whole working day, rather, seems to consist simply of the kinds of labor that do not result in means of production, but rather in means of consumption. The riddle is already solved. The value product of the annual labor is equal to the value of the product of Department 2, the total of the newly produced means of consumption. But the value of this product is 3 times greater than the part of the annual labor that is spent on the production of means of consumption in Department 2. Only 1/3 of the annual labor is spent on producing these. 2/3 of the annual labor is spent on producing means of production in Department 1. The value product created in this period in Department 1, equal to the variable capital value reproduced in Department 1 plus the surplus value, is equal to the constant capital value of Department 2 that reappears in Department 2 in means of consumption. These can therefore be exchanged for one another and replace one another in kind. The total value of the means of consumption in Department 2 is therefore equal to the sum of the new value products in Departments 1 and 2 together, or Department 2's C plus V plus S is equal to Department 1's V plus S plus Department 2's V plus S, i.e. the total new value produced by the annual labor in the form of V plus S. On the other hand, the total value of the means of production of Department 1 is equal to the sum of the constant capital values reappearing in the form of means of production and means of consumption, that is Department 2, i.e. equal to the total constant capital value reappearing in the society's total product. This total value is, in Department 1, the value expression of 4/3 of a working day performed before the current production process and 2/3 in Department 2, making a total of 2 complete working days. The difficulty with the annual social product, therefore, comes from the fact that the constant portion of value is represented in a kind of product, means of production, completely different from the means of consumption, in which the new value V plus S added to this constant portion of value is represented. It seems, therefore, as if 2/3 of the mass of products consumes, in value terms, exist once again in a new form, as new product, without any kind of labor having been expended by the society on their production. This is not the case with the individual capital. Each individual capitalist applies a definite concrete kind of labor, which transforms the means of production peculiar to it into a product. Say, for example, that the capitalist is involved in engineering. The constant capital spent during the year, 6,000 C, the variable capital 1,500 V, and the surplus value 1,500 S. The product is then 9,000, and we can take it as a product of 18 machines, each worth 500. The entire product there exists in the same form, that of machines. If he produces different kinds, then each of these must be dealt with separately. The total commodity product is the product of the labor expended during the year in engineering. The combination of this concrete kind of labor with its specific means of production. The various parts of the product's value are therefore represented in the same natural form. 12 machines contain 6,000 C, 3 machines 1,500 V, 3 machines 1,500 S. It is evident here that if the value of the 12 machines that comprise the constant capital is equal to 6,000 C, this is not because the labor embodied in these machines took place before the engineering stage was reached and was not spent in it. The value of the means of production for 18 machines has not been transformed of itself into 12 machines. It is rather the value of these 12 machines, which itself consists of 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S, that is equal to the total value of the constant capital value contained in the 18 machines. The capitalist engineer must therefore sell 12 of the 18 machines in order to replace the constant capital he has spent, that needed for the reproduction of 18 new machines. What would be inexplicable, rather, would be a situation in which, although the labor applied consisted simply of engineering labor, its result was on the one hand 6 machines of 1,500 V plus 1,500 S, and on the other hand iron, copper, screws, belts, etc., to a value of 6,000 C, i.e. the means of production of the machines in their natural form, which the individual capitalist engineer obviously does not produce himself, but must replace by way of the circulation process. And yet it seems at first glance as if the reproduction of the annual social product does proceed in such a contradictory way. The product of an individual capital, i.e. each independently functioning fraction of the social capital endowed with its own life, may have any natural form whatsoever. The only condition is that it really should have a use form, a use value, that stamps it as a member of the commodity world capable of circulation. It is completely immaterial and accidental whether or not it can go back as a means of production into the same production process from which it emerged as a product, i.e. whether the part of the product's value that represents the constant capital component possesses a natural form in which it can actually function once again as constant capital. If not, then this part of the product's value is transformed again by sale and purchase into the material elements of its production, and thereby reproduces the constant capital again in its natural form, the form in which it is capable of fulfilling its function. It is different with the product of the total social capital. All material elements of the reproduction must be parts of this product in their natural form. The portion of constant capital consumed can be replaced by the overall production only if the entire reappearing constant portion of capital reappears in the product in the natural form of new means of production that actually can function as constant capital. On the assumption of simple reproduction, therefore, the value of the portion of the product that consists of means of production must be equal to the consumed constant portion of the value of the social capital. Moreover, considered individually, all that the capitalist produces in the value of his product, by the labor newly added to it, is his variable capital and his surplus value, while the constant capital component is transferred to the product by the concrete character of the labor newly added. Socially considered, however, the portion of the social working day that produces means of production, both adding new value to them and transferring to them the value of the means of production consumed while they were being produced, produces nothing but new constant capital, destined to replace that consumed in the form of the old means of production, the constant capital consumed in both departments 1 and 2. It only produces a product destined for productive consumption. The entire value of this product is therefore only value that functions anew as constant capital, which can only buy back constant capital in its natural form, and which is therefore, from the social point of view, resolved neither into variable capital nor into surplus value. On the other hand, the part of the social working day that produces means of consumption does not produce any part of the social replacement capital. It produces only products that, in their natural form, are destined to realize the value of the variable capital and the surplus value in departments 1 and 2. In speaking of the social point of view, i.e. in considering the total social product, which includes both the reproduction of the social capital and individual consumption, it is necessary to avoid falling into the habits of bourgeois economics, as imitated by Proudhon, i.e. to avoid looking at things as if a society based on the capitalist mode of production lost its specific historical and economic character when considered en bloc, as a totality. This is not the case at all. What we have to deal with is the collective capitalist. The total capital appears as the share capital of all individual capitalists together. This joint stock company has in common with many other joint stock companies that everyone knows what they put into it, but not what they will get out of it. Section 9. A look back at Adam Smith, Stork, and Ramsey. The total value of the social product is 9,000, being 6,000 C plus 1,500 V plus 1,500 S. In other words, 6,000 reproduces the value of the means of production, and 3,000 the value of the means of consumption. The value of the social revenue, V plus S, thus amounts to only 1/3 of the value of the total product, and the totality of consumers, both workers and capitalists, can withdraw commodities, i.e. products, from the total social product and incorporate them into their consumption fund only to the amount of this 1/3 part of value. 6,000, 2/3 of the product's value, on the other hand, is the value of the constant capital that has to be replaced in kind. Means of production to this amount must therefore be reincorporated into the production fund. This is something that Stork realizes is necessary without being able to prove it. Quote, "It is clear that the value of the annual product is divided in part into capital and in part into profit, and that each of these parts of the annual value of the product regularly goes to buy the products that the nation needs, both to maintain its capital and to replace its consumption fund. The products that constitute the capital of a nation can in no way be consumed." End quote from Stork, Considerations of the Nature of National Revenue, published in Paris in 1824. Yet Adam Smith puts forward this fanciful dogma, which is still believed to this day, in the form already discussed, according to which the entire value of the social product resolves itself into revenue, i.e. into wages plus surplus value, or, as he expresses it, into wages plus profit, interest plus rent. He also put it forward in the still more popular form that the consumers must ultimately pay the producers for the entire value of the products. Right to the present, this remains one of the most well-loved platitudes, or rather eternal truths, of the so-called science of political economy. It is demonstrated in the following plausible way. Take an article of some kind, for example, linen shirts. First, the spinner of linen yarn has to pay the flax grower the entire value of the flax, i.e. flaxseed, manure, animal fodder, etc., together with the portion of value that the flax grower's fixed capital, such as buildings, agricultural instruments, etc., surrenders to this product, the wages paid in the production of the flax, the surplus value, profit, and ground rent that is contained in the flax, finally, the freight cost of the flax from its point of production to the spinning mill. The weaver then has to reimburse the spinner of linen yarn not only with this price of the flax, but also with the portion of value in the machinery, buildings, etc., in other words, of the fixed capital that is transferred to the flax, as well as that of all ancillary materials consumed during the spinning process, the wages of the spinners, surplus value, etc., and this is then taken a stage further with the bleacher, the transport costs of the finished linen, and finally the shirt manufacturer, who has to pay the whole price of all the earlier producers who have only supplied him with his raw material. In his hands, a further addition of values takes place, partly through the constant capital value that is consumed in the form of means of labor, ancillaries, etc., in the manufacture of shirts, and partly through the labor spent in this process, which adds the value of the shirt maker's wages plus the surplus value of the shirt manufacturer. Let the entire shirt product now cost £100, and say that this is the share in the total value of the annual product that society spends on shirts. The consumers of shirts pay £100, i.e. the value of all the means of production contained in the shirts, together with the wages plus surplus value of the flax grower, spinner, weaver, bleacher, shirt manufacturer, and all the transporters as well. This is completely correct, and this is in fact what any child can see. But then it is further said, this is how things stand with the value of all means of consumption, with the value of the part of the social product that goes into the consumption fund, i.e. with the part of the value of the social product that can be spent as revenue. The value sum of all these commodities is moreover equal to the value of all means of production consumed in them, the constant capital component, plus the value that the labor last added to them has created, wages plus surplus value. The totality of consumers can pay this whole value, because although the value of each individual commodity certainly consists of C plus V plus S, the value sum of all the commodities that enter into the consumption fund taken together, at its maximum, can only be equal to the portion of the value of the social product that is resolved into V plus S, i.e. equal to the value that the labor spent during the year has added to the means of production available, to the constant capital value. As far as the constant capital value is concerned, however, we have seen that it is replaced in two ways from the social product. Firstly, by exchange between the capitalists in Department 2, who produce means of consumption, and those in Department 1 who produce the means of production for them. Here is the source of the phrase that what is capital for one is revenue for another. But this is not how things are at all. The 2,000 of Department 2's C that exists in means of consumption to the value of 2,000 forms constant capital value for the capitalists in Department 2. These cannot therefore consume it themselves, even though the product has to be consumed individually on account of its natural form. The 2,000 of Department 1's V plus S, on the other hand, is the wages and surplus value produced by the capitalist and workers in Department 1. It exists in the natural form of means of production, as things in which their own value cannot be individually consumed. We have here, therefore, a value sum of 4,000, of which half simply replaces constant capital and half simply forms revenue, both before and after the exchange. Secondly, however, the constant capital of Department 1 is replaced in kind, partly by exchange among the capitalists in Department 1, partly by replacement in kind in each particular business. The phrase that the entire value of the annual product must finally be paid by the consumers would be correct only if the expression consumers were taken to include two quite different kinds of consumer, individual consumers and productive ones, But if a part of the product has to be consumed productively, this means nothing more than that it has to function as capital and cannot be consumed as revenue. If we divide the value of the total product of 9,000 into 6,000 C plus 1,500 V plus 1,500 S and consider the 3,000 V plus S simply in its capacity as revenue, then it is the variable capital that seems to vanish, and capital considered from this standpoint seems to consist only of constant capital. For what originally appeared as 1,500 V has resolved itself into a part of the social revenue, into wages, the revenue of the working class, and its character as capital has therewith vanished. This conclusion is in fact drawn by Ramsay. According to him, capital consists from the social standpoint of fixed capital alone, and by fixed capital he means constant capital, the mass of values consisting of means of production, whether these means of production are means of labor or materials of labor, such as raw material, work in progress, ancillaries, etc. He calls the variable capital circulating. Quote, circulating capital consists only of subsistence and other necessities advanced to the workmen, previous to the completion of the produce of their labor. Fixed capital alone, not circulating, is properly speaking a source of national wealth. Circulating capital is not an immediate agent in production, nor essential to it at all, but merely a convenience rendered necessary by the deplorable poverty of the mass of the people. Fixed capital alone constitutes an element of cost of production in a national point of view. End quote from Ramsay. This fixed capital, by which he means constant capital, Ramsay explains in more detail as follows. Quote, the length of time during which any portion of the product of that labor, i.e., labor bestowed on any commodity, has existed as fixed capital, i.e., in a form which, though assisting to raise the future commodity, it does not maintain laborers. End quote. Here we see once again the confusion that Adam Smith wrought by submerging the distinction between constant and variable capital and the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. Ramsay's constant capital consists of means of labor, his circulating capital of means of subsistence. Both of these are in fact commodities of a fixed value. The one is just as incapable of producing a surplus value as the other. Section 10. Capital and revenue. Variable capital and wages. The overall annual reproduction, the entire product of the current year, is the product of the useful labor of this year. But the value of this total product is greater than the portion of its value which embodies the annual labor, i.e., the labor spent during this year. The value product of the current year, the value newly created during the year in the commodity form, is smaller than the value of the product, the total value of the mass of commodities produced during the year. The difference which we obtain when we subtract from the total value of the annual product the value that was added to it by the labor of the current year is not value really reproduced, but simply value that reappears in a new form of existence, value transferred to the annual product from value that existed beforehand, of an earlier or later date, depending on the durability of the constant capital component involved in the current year's social labor process. This value may derive from the value of a means of production which came into the world in the preceding year or in one of a series of earlier years. It is at all events value transferred from the means of production of previous years to the product of the current year. If we take our schema, we have, after exchange of the elements already dealt with between Departments 1 and 2 and within Department 2, 1. 4,000 C plus 1,000 V plus 1,000 S, the latter 2,000 realized in means of consumption of Department 2C, totaling 6,000. 2. 2,000 C, reproduced by exchange with Department 1's V plus S, plus 500 V plus 500 S, being 3,000. The sum of the values is 9,000. Value newly produced during the year is to be found only in V and S. The value product of the current year is thus equal to the sum of V plus S, 2,000 of Department 1's V plus S plus 1,000 of Department 2's V plus S, being 3,000. All other value components of this year's product are simply value transferred from the value of earlier means of production that have been consumed in the current year's production. Besides this value of 3,000, the current year's labor has produced nothing more. This is its entire annual value product. As we have seen, however, the 2,000 of Department 1's V plus S restores to Department 2 its 2,000 C in the natural form of means of production. The 2/3 of the annual labor spent in Department 1 has thus newly produced the constant capital for Department 2, both in its entire value and in its natural form. Considered from the social standpoint, therefore, 2/3 of the labor spent during the year creates new constant capital value, realized in the natural form appropriate for Department 2. The greater part of the annual social labor is therefore spent on the production of new constant capital, capital value existing in means of production, to replace the constant capital value spent on the production of means of consumption. What distinguishes capitalist society from the savages in this respect is not, as Signor thinks, that it is the privilege and the characteristic of the savage to spend part of his labor in a way that procures him nothing in revenue, i.e., in proceeds that can be resolved into or exchanged for means of consumption. The distinction rather consists in this. A. Capitalist society spends more of its disposable annual labor on the production of means of production, therefore of constant capital, which cannot be resolved into revenue in the form of wages or of surplus value, but can function only as capital. B. If the savage makes bows, arrows, stone hammers, axes, baskets, etc., he knows well enough that he has not spent the time thus employed on the production of means of consumption, i.e., that he has met his need for means of production and nothing else. Besides, the savage commits a serious economic sin by his complete indifference to the use of his time, and may often spend a whole month, as Tyler tells us, on preparing a single arrow. The current notion by which one group of political economists seek to rid themselves of the theoretical difficulty, i.e., to avoid understanding the real relationship, the idea that what is capital for one person is revenue for another, and vice versa, is partially correct, but becomes completely false as soon as it is put forward as a general rule, i.e., it involves a complete misunderstanding of the whole process of exchange that occurs in conjunction with annual reproduction, and also, therefore, a misunderstanding of the actual reason why the notion is partially correct. We shall now summarize the factual relationships on which the partial correctness of this notion rests, and in so doing we shall also demonstrate how false is the current conception of these relationships. 1. The variable capital functions as capital in the hands of the capitalist, and as revenue in the hands of the wage laborer. The variable capital first exists in the hands of the capitalist as money capital. It functions as money capital insofar as he buys labor power with it. As long as it persists in his hands in the money form, it is nothing more than a given value existing in that form, i.e., a constant and not a variable magnitude. It is only potentially variable capital, and it is that precisely because it is capable of being converted into labor power. It only becomes actual variable capital after shedding its money form, after it has been converted into labor power, and when this begins to function as a component of productive capital in the capitalist process. The money that functions firstly as the money form of variable capital for the capitalist now functions in the hands of the worker as the money form of his wage, which he converts into means of subsistence, i.e., as the money form of the revenue that he receives from the ever-repeated sale of his labor power. We have here the simple fact that the money of the buyer, here the capitalist, passes from his hands into those of the seller, in this case the seller of labor power, the worker. It is not the variable capital that functions twice over, as capital for the capitalist and as revenue for the worker, but simply the same money, which exists first in the hands of the capitalist as the money form of his variable capital, hence as potential variable capital, and which, once the capitalist has converted it into labor power, serves in the hands of the worker as the equivalent for the labor power he has sold. However, the fact that the same money serves one purpose in the hands of the seller and another in the hands of the buyer is simply a phenomenon inherent in all purchases and sales of commodities. Apologetic economists present the matter wrongly, as is best shown if we look simply at the act of circulation M to L, being M to C, the conversion of money into labor power on the part of the capitalist buyer, and L to M, being C to M, the conversion of the commodity labor power into money on the part of the seller, the worker, without troubling ourselves for the moment with any of its further consequences. They say that the same money here realizes two capitals. The buyer, the capitalist, converts his money capital into living labor power, which he incorporates into his productive capital. On the other hand, the seller, the worker, converts his commodity, labor power, into money that he spends as revenue, which is precisely what enables him to sell his labor power over and over again, and thus to maintain himself. His labor power is thus actually his capital in the commodity form, from which he constantly draws his revenue. In point of fact, labor power is his capacity, ever renewing and reproducing itself, not his capital. It is the only commodity that he can constantly sell, and he has to sell it in order to live, but it operates as capital, variable capital, only in the hands of the buyer, the capitalist. If a man is perpetually forced to sell his labor power over and over again, i.e. to sell himself to someone else, this proves, according to these economists, that he is a capitalist, because he always has a commodity, that is himself, for sale. In this sense, even a slave would be a capitalist, even though he is sold once and for all as a commodity by a third person, for the nature of this commodity, the working slave, not only requires that its buyer put it to work each day, but also that he give it the means of subsistence that it needs in order to be able to work again. Compare on this point Sismondi and Say in the letters to Malthus. 2. In the exchange of 1,000 of Department 1's V plus 1,000 of Department 1's S for 2,000 of Department 2's C, therefore, what is constant capital for some people, that's the 2,000 C belonging to Department 2, becomes variable capital and surplus value, and thus completely revenue, for others. And what was variable capital and surplus value, that is 2,000 of Department 1's V plus S, i.e. entirely revenue for some, becomes constant capital for others. Let us firstly consider the exchange of Department 1's V and Department 2's C, and initially from the standpoint of the worker. The collective worker in Department 1 has sold his labor power to the collective capitalist of Department 1 for 1,000. He receives this value paid in money in the form of a wage. With this money, he buys means of consumption to the same amount from Department 2. The capitalist in Department 2 confronts him simply as a seller of commodities and nothing else, which is even the case when the worker buys from his own capitalist, as above, for example, in the exchange of the 500V from Department 2. The form of circulation that his commodity, labor power, undergoes is that of simple commodity circulation. C to M to C, labor power to money to means of consumption, the commodity of Department 2. Oriented to consumption, i.e. simply to the satisfaction of needs. The result of this act of circulation is that the worker has maintained himself as labor power for the Department 1 capitalist, and in order to carry on maintaining himself in this way, he has perpetually to repeat the process, L to M to C, over again. His wage is realized in means of consumption, it is spent as revenue, and taking the working class as a whole, it goes on being spent as revenue continuously. Let us now consider the same exchange of Department 1's V for Department 2's C from the standpoint of the capitalist. The entire commodity product of Department 2 consists of means of consumption, i.e. of things designed to go into the annual consumption, to serve as the realization of someone or other's revenue, and in the present case, the collective worker of Department 1. For the collective capitalist of Department 2, however, a part of his commodity product, 2,000, is now the form of the constant capital value of his productive capital, and must be transformed back again from this commodity form into the natural form in which it can operate anew as the constant part of the productive capital. So far, Capitalist 2 has managed to transform half, 1,000, of his constant capital value, reproduced in the commodity form, that of means of consumption, back into the money form by selling it to the workers of Department 1. Thus it is not the variable capital 1V that has been converted into this first half of the constant capital value 2C, but rather the money that functioned for Department 1 as money capital in exchange for labor power, and hence came into the possession of the seller of labor power, for whom it did not represent capital, but rather revenue in the money form, i.e. was spent as a means of purchase on items of consumption. The 1,000 in money that flowed to the capitalists in Department 2 from the workers of Department 1 cannot function as a constant element of Department 2's productive capital. It is only the money form of its commodity capital, and still has to be converted into fixed or circulating components of constant capital. Department 2 therefore uses the money received from the workers of Department 1, the buyers of its commodities, to buy means of production from Department 1. In this way, half of Department 2's constant capital value is renewed in the natural form in which it can function once again as an element of productive capital in Department 2. The form of circulation here was C to M to C, means of consumption to a value of 1,000, to money of 1,000, and finally to means of production to a value of 1,000. Here, however, C to M to C is a movement of capital. C, sold to the workers, is transformed into M, and this M is converted into means of production. It is a transformation from commodities back into the material elements for the formation of these commodities. On the other hand, just as the collective capitalist of Department 2 functions for Department 1 only as buyer of commodities, so the collective capitalist of Department 1 functions for Department 2 here only as a seller of commodities. Department 1 originally bought labor power to the value of 1,000, with 1,000 of money which was destined to function as variable capital. It thereby received an equivalent for the 1,000 V's spent in the money form. The money now belongs to the worker, who spends it on purchases from Department 2. Department 1 can get back this money, which has flowed into Department 2's cash box, only if it fishes it out again by selling commodities to the same total value. Department 1 first had a certain sum of money, 1,000, destined to function as variable capital. This sum functions as variable capital by being converted into labor power of the same value. As a result of the production process, however, the worker is provided a quantity of commodities, means of production, to the value of 6,000, of which 1/6 or 1,000 is an equivalent value for the variable portion of capital advanced in money. The variable capital no more functions as variable capital in its commodity form than it did in its previous money form. As money, the variable capital value was only potentially variable capital, though it did exist in a form in which it could be directly converted into labor power. As a commodity, however, this same variable capital value is still only potentially money value. It is restored to its original money form only by the sale of the commodity, i.e. here by the purchase by Department 2 of 1,000 of commodities from Department 1. The movement of circulation is now 1,000 in money to labor power to a value of 1,000, to 1,000 in commodities, the equivalent for the variable capital, to 1,000 V in money, i.e. M to C to M, being M to L to C to M. The production process that falls between C and C in the above track does not itself pertain to the circulation sphere. It does not appear in the mutual exchange of the various elements of annual reproduction, even though this exchange includes the reproduction of all elements of the productive capital, not only its constant element but also its variable element, labor power. All agents in this exchange simply appear as buyers and sellers, or both. The workers appear in it simply as commodity buyers, the capitalists alternately as buyers and sellers, and within certain limits simply as unilateral buyers or sellers. The result of all of this is that Department 1 once more possesses the variable portion of its capital in the money form, the only form from which it is directly convertible back into labor power, i.e. it possesses it again in the only form in which it can actually be advanced as the variable element of its productive capital. On the other hand, in order to reappear as a buyer of commodities, the worker must firstly reappear as the seller of a commodity, as the seller of his own labor power. As far as the variable capital in Department 2 is concerned, that is 5,000 V, the circulation process between capitalists and workers in this department of production takes an unmediated form, inasmuch as we consider it as taking place between the collective capitalist in Department 2 and the collective worker there. The collective capitalist in Department 2 advances 500 V for the purchase of labor power to the same value. The collective capitalist is here the buyer, the collective worker the seller. The worker then appears with the money received for his labor power, as the buyer of a part of the commodities that he himself produced. Here, therefore, the capitalist is a seller. The worker has replaced the money the capitalist advanced to him for the purchase of his labor power with a part of the commodity capital produced in Department 2, i.e. 500 V in commodities. The capitalist now possesses, in the commodity form, the same V that he possessed in the money form before converting it into labor power. The worker, for his part, has realized the value of his labor power in money, and realizes this money in turn by spending it, as revenue to meet his consumption, on acquiring a part of the means of consumption that he himself produced. This is an exchange of the worker's revenue, in money, for the capitalist commodity component, 500 V, that the worker himself reproduced in the commodity form. This money thereby returns to capitalist 2 as the money form of his variable capital. An equal value of revenue in the money form here replaces variable capital value in the commodity form. The capitalist does not get any richer by taking back the money that he paid the worker for the purchase of labor power when he sells the worker an equivalent quantity of commodities. He would in fact be paying the worker twice over if he first paid him 500 for the purchase of his labor power and then gave him for nothing, on top of this, the quantity of commodities to the value of 500 that he has had the worker produce. Conversely, if the worker did not produce anything more for him than an equivalent of 500 commodities for the price of his labor power of 500, then the capitalist would be in exactly the same position after the operation as before it. However, the worker has reproduced a product of 3,000. He has maintained the constant value portion of the product, i.e. the value of the means of production, being 2,000 used up in transforming it into a new product, and he has added to this given value a further value of 1,000 V plus S. The notion that the capitalist gets rich and obtains the surplus value by this reflux of 500 in money is put forward by Destutt de Tracy and is dealt with in more detail in section 13 of this chapter. The value of 500 V of Department 2, which the Department 1 capitalist still possesses in commodities, returns to him in the form in which he originally advanced it by the purchase of means of consumption to the value of 500 on the part of the Department 2 worker. The immediate result of this transaction, as with every other sale of commodities, is the conversion of a given value from the commodity form into the money form. The reflux of money to its starting point that this brings about is also nothing unique. If Capitalist 2 had bought commodities from Capitalist 1 for 500 in money, then 500 in money would have also flowed back to him. The 500 in money would have served simply to exchange a quantity of commodities of 1,000, and according to the general law put forward above, it would have flowed back to whoever it was that cast the money into circulation for the exchange of this mass of commodities. But the 500 that has flowed back to Capitalist 2 in money is at the same time renewed potential variable capital in the money form. Why is this? Money, and this of course includes money capital, is potential variable capital only because and insofar as it is convertible into labor power. The return of the 500 in money to Capitalist 2 is accompanied by the return of Department 2's labor power to the market. The return of both of these at opposite poles, i.e. the reappearance of the 500 in money, not just as money but also as variable capital in the money form, is conditioned by one and the same procedure. The 500 in money flows back to Capitalist 2 because he has sold worker 2 the means of consumption to the value of 500, i.e. because the worker has spent his wage, and in this way has maintained not only himself and his family but also his labor power. In order to carry on living and to reappear as a buyer of commodities, he must sell his labor power afresh. The return of the 500 in money to capitalist 2 is thus simultaneously the return, or the preservation, of labor power as a commodity available for purchase with 500 in money, and hence the return of the 500 in money as potential variable capital. As far as Subdivision 2b, the production of luxury goods, is concerned, the same thing takes place with its V as with Department 1's V. The money that renews the 2b capitalist variable capital in the money form flows to them via a detour through the hands of the capitalist 2a. It still makes a difference, for all that, whether the workers buy their means of subsistence directly from the capitalist producers to whom they sell their labor power, or whether they buy them from another category of capitalists, so that the money flows back to the first category only by a detour. Since the working class lives from hand to mouth, it buys as long as it is able to. It is different with the capitalists, for instance in the exchange of 1002C for 1001V. The capitalist does not live from hand to mouth. His driving motive is the greatest possible valorization of his capital. Hence, if circumstances of any kind intervene, which make it appear more advantageous to the capitalist in Department 2 to retain at least part of his constant capital in the money form for a longer time, instead of directly replacing it all, the reflux of the 1002C in money to Department 1 is then delayed. So too, therefore, is the restoration of the 1000V in its money form, and the capitalist 1 can only continue operating on the same scale if he has some reserve money available, just as reserve capital and money is generally necessary in order to be able to continue operations without interruption, regardless of whether the reflux of the variable capital value in money is quicker or slower. Besides investigating the exchange of the various elements of current annual reproduction, we must also investigate the results of the previous year's labor, the labor of the year that has already come to a close. The production process that resulted in this annual product lies behind us. It is past and has disappeared into its product. This is ever more the case with the circulation process that preceded this production process, or ran parallel with it, the conversion of potential into actual variable capital, i.e. the purchase and sale of labor power. The labor market no longer forms any part of the commodity market we are dealing with here. The worker has not only already sold his labor power, he has also supplied in commodities, besides the surplus value, an equivalent for the price of his labor power. He has, on the other hand, got his wages in his pocket, and figures in the exchange only as a buyer of commodities, means of consumption. However, the annual product must contain all the elements of reproduction, and restore all the elements of productive capital, including in particular the latter's most important element, the variable capital. And we have in fact already seen that as far as the variable capital is concerned, the result of the exchange is as follows. The worker, as a buyer of commodities, maintains and reproduces his labor power as the only commodity that he has for sale by spending his wage and consuming the commodities bought. Just as the money advanced by the capitalist on the purchase of labor power returns to him, so the labor power too returns to the labor market as a commodity exchangeable for this money. The result we obtain for the particular case of 1001V is 1000V in money on the side of the Department 1 capitalists, and on the other hand, labor power to the value of 1000 on the side of the Department 1 workers, so that the entire process of reproduction in Department 1 can begin again. This is one result of the exchange process. By spending their wages, on the other hand, the workers in Department 1 have withdrawn means of consumption to the sum of 1000C from Department 2, and thereby transformed these from the commodity form into the money form. Department 2 has transformed its constant capital back from this money form into its natural form, by the purchase of commodities, being 1000V from Department 1, and in this way Department 1's variable capital value flows back to it again in the money form. The variable capital in Department 1 undergoes 3 changes of form, which do not appear at all in the exchange of the annual product, or do so only by intimation. 1. Its first form is that of 1000V in money, which is converted into labor power to the same value. This conversion does not itself appear in the commodity exchange between Departments 1 and 2, although its result appears in the fact that the working class of Department 1 faces the commodity seller of Department 2 with 1000 in money, just as the working class of Department 2 faces the commodity seller of 502V in the commodity form with 500 in money. 2. The second form, the only one in which the variable capital actually varies, i.e. actually functions as variable capital, where value-creating power appears in place of the value given in exchange for it, pertains exclusively to the production process that lies behind us. 3. The third form, in which the variable capital has demonstrated its quality of being variable in the results of the production process, is the annual value product, which in the case of Department 1 is 1000V plus 1000S, totaling 2000V plus S. In place of its original value of 1000 in money, twice this value has appeared in commodities. The variable capital value of 1000 in commodities thus forms only half of the value product created by the variable capital as an element of the productive capital. The 1000 V in commodities is the exact equivalent to the part of the total capital originally advanced by Department 1 with the 1000 V in money, and earmarked as the variable part. In the commodity form, however, it is only potentially money. It actually becomes money only by its sale, and so still less directly is it variable money capital. Ultimately, it will become so by the sale of the commodities of 1V for 2C, and by the rapid appearance of labor power as a purchasable commodity, as material into which the 1000 V in money can be converted. During all these changes, Capitalist 1 constantly keeps in hand his variable capital. 1. Originally as money capital, 2. Then as an element of his productive capital, 3. Later as a value component of his commodity capital, i.e. in commodity value, 4. Finally in money again, and once more standing face to face with the labor power into which it is convertible. During the labor process, the capitalist has the variable capital in his hands as self-acting, value-creating labor power, but not as value of a given magnitude. However, since he pays the worker only after his power has already operated for a definite period of time, whether longer or shorter, he already has the replacement value that the labor power creates for itself in his hands before he pays, as well as the surplus value. Since this variable capital always remains in one form or other in the hands of the capitalist, it can in no way be said to be converted into revenue for anyone. 1000 V in commodities is rather converted into money by its sale to Department 2, for which it replaces half of its constant capital in kind. What is resolved into revenue is not Department 1's variable capital of 1000 V in money. The money has ceased to function as the money form of Department 1's variable capital as soon as it is converted into labor power, just as the money of any other commodity seller has ceased to represent anything belonging to him once he has exchanged it for a commodity being sold. The conversions undergone by the money drawn in wages in the hands of the working class are not conversions of variable capital, but rather of the value of their labor power transformed into money, just as the conversion of this value product created by the worker, 2000 V plus S, is simply the conversion of a commodity belonging to the capitalist, and does not affect the worker. It is, however, very difficult for the capitalist, and still more so for his theoretical interpreter, the political economist, to rid himself of the idea that the money paid to the worker is still the capitalist's money. If the capitalist is a producer of gold, then the variable portion of value, i.e. the equivalent in commodities that compensates him for the purchase price of labor, directly appears in the money form, and can therefore function anew as variable money capital without the detour of a reflux. As far as the Department 2 worker is concerned, however, ignoring here the luxury worker, 500 V actually exists in commodities that are destined for the worker's consumption, commodities which he buys, considered as the collective worker, directly from the same collective capitalist to whom he has sold his labor power. The variable value portion of Department 2's capital consists of means of consumption, as far as its natural form is concerned, destined for the most part to be consumed by the working class. But it is not the variable capital that is spent by the worker in this form, it is the wage, the worker's money, that reestablishes for the capitalist his variable capital 500 V in its money form, precisely through its realization in these means of consumption. The variable capital 2V is reproduced in means of consumption, just as is the constant capital 2000 2C. The one is no more resolved into revenue than the other. What is resolved into revenue is in both cases the wage. But if 1002C, and by the same detour 1001V and 502V, i.e. both constant capital and variable, are restored as money capital by the expenditure of wages as revenue, this is an important fact in the exchange of the annual product. In the case of the variable capital, this is partly by a direct reflux and partly by an indirect one. Section 11. Replacement of the fixed capital. A major problem in depicting the conversions involved in the annual reproduction is the following. If we take the simplest form in which the matter presents itself, we have Department 1, 4000C plus 1000V plus 1000S plus Department 2, 2000C plus 500V plus 500S, totaling 9000, which is ultimately resolved into 4001C plus 2002C plus 1001V plus 502V plus 1001S plus 502S, totaling 6000C plus 1500V plus 1500S, totaling 9000. One portion of the constant capital value, that which consists of means of labor in the strict sense, as a distinct division of the means of production, is transferred from the means of labor to the product of labor, the commodity, while these means of labor still continue to function as elements of the productive capital, and moreover in their old natural form. What is transferred from the instrument to the product of labor, and reappears as an element of the value of the commodities that these means of labor produce, is their wear and tear, the loss of value that they suffer bit by bit in the course of their function over a certain period. As far as the annual reproduction is concerned, therefore, only those components of the fixed capital whose life is longer than a year come into consideration. If they expire in the course of the year, then they have to be completely replaced and renewed by the annual reproduction, and the point at issue here in no way concerns them. In the case of machines and other more long-lasting forms of fixed capital, it may happen, and more often than not does happen, that certain partial organs of the same have to be entirely replaced within the year, even though the building or machine as a whole has a longer life. These partial organs fall into the same category of elements of fixed capital that have to be replaced within the year. This element of commodity value should in no way be confused with the costs of repair. When the commodity is sold, this value element is realized and transformed into money like the others. It is only after this transformation that its difference from the other elements of value comes into view. The raw materials and ancillaries consumed in the production of commodities have to be replaced in kind so that the reproduction of the commodities can begin, and generally so that the process of commodity production can be continuous. The labor power spent on them must similarly be replaced by fresh labor power. The money received from the commodity must therefore be constantly converted back into these elements of productive capital, from the money form into the commodity form. This is in no way changed by the fact that the raw materials and ancillaries may be bought at certain dates on relatively large scale so that they form production reserves, and for a certain interval therefore, these means of production do not need to be bought anew. As long as they last, the money received from the sale of the commodities can be collected, insofar as it serves this purpose, and this part of the constant capital temporarily appears as money capital whose active function is suspended. The means of production must always be renewed, even if the form of this renewal may differ as far as its circulation is concerned. The new purchase, the circulation operation by which the means of production are renewed or replaced, can proceed at longer intervals. Then, large investments of money are made at a time, compensated for by corresponding production reserves. Alternatively, it takes place at closely following dates, in which case small doses of money expenditure follow each other more quickly, and there are smaller production stocks. This in no way alters the matter itself. The same is the case with labor power. Where production is continuously carried on at the same level throughout the year, there is a constant replacement of the labor power consumed with new labor power. Where labor is seasonal, or different amounts of labor are applied in different periods, as in agriculture, there is a corresponding purchase of quantities of labor power of varying magnitude. But the part of the money received from the sale of commodities that represents the realized value component of the commodities, which is equal to the wear and tear of the fixed capital, is not transformed back again into the component of productive capital whose loss of value it replaces. It settles down alongside the productive capital and persists in its money form. This precipitation of money is repeated until the reproduction period, during which the fixed element of the constant capital continues to function in the production process in its old natural form, and which consists of a greater or lesser number of years, has elapsed. Once the fixed element, buildings, machinery, etc., has expired and can no longer function in the production process, its value exists alongside it, completely converted into money, as the sum of the money precipitated, the sum of the values which were gradually transferred from the fixed capital to the commodities in whose production it collaborated, and which passed over into the money form when these commodities were sold. This money then serves to replace the fixed capital in kind, or elements of it as the various elements have different lifespans, and thus really to replace this component of the productive capital. It is therefore the money form of a part of the constant capital value, of the fixed part of it. This hoard formation is therefore itself an element of the capitalist reproduction process, the reproduction and storage, in the money form, of the value of the fixed capital or its individual elements, until such a time as the fixed capital has expired and consequently surrendered the whole of its value to the commodities produced, when it has to be replaced in kind. This money, however, gives up its hoard form and again steps actively into the reproduction process of capital mediated by circulation only after it has been transformed back into new elements of fixed capital to replace the dead ones. The reconversion of the annual commodity product can no more be resolved into the mere unmediated mutual exchange of its various components than simple commodity circulation is identical with the direct exchange of products. Money plays a specific role in it, one which is expressed in the very manner in which the fixed capital value is reproduced. Later, we shall go on to investigate how different things would look if it were assumed that production was collective and did not have the form of commodity production. If we return to our basic schema, we had for Department 2, 2000C plus 500V plus 500S. The total means of consumption produced in the course of the year amount here to a value of 3,000, and each of the various elements which this sum of commodities consists of can be broken down, as far as its value goes, into 2/3 C plus 1/6 V plus 1/6 S, or in percentages, 66 and 2/3 C, 16 and 2/3 V, and 16 and 2/3 S. The various kinds of commodity in Department 2 may contain different proportions of constant capital. The fixed parts of the constant capital may similarly differ, and so too may the lifespans of the fixed portions of capital, and thus the annual wear and tear, or the portion of value that they proportionately transfer to the commodities in whose production they participate. This is all immaterial here. As far as the social reproduction is concerned, all that is involved is the exchange between departments 2 and 1. These departments face each other here in their mass social relations. The proportionate magnitude of the value component C in the commodity product of Department 2, which is alone decisive in the question now being considered, is therefore the average when all branches of production that are subsumed under Department 2 are taken together. Each of those kinds of commodity, whose total value is summarized as 2000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S, and they are for the most part similar kinds, is thus similarly equal in its value in percentages to 66 2/3 C plus 16 2/3 V plus 16 2/3 S. This holds for each 100 commodities, whether these figure under C, V, or S. The commodities in which the 2000 C is embodied can be broken down, as far as their value goes, into 1. 1,333 1/3 C, plus 333 1/3 V, plus 333 1/3 S, totaling 2000 C. Similarly, the 500 V into 2. 333 1/3 C, plus 83 1/3 V, plus 83 1/3 S, totaling 500 V, and finally the 500 S into 3. 333 1/3 C, plus 83 1/3 V, plus 83 1/3 S, totaling 500 S. If we now add the C's of 1, 2, and 3 together, we have 1,333 1/3 C, plus 333 1/3 C, plus 333 1/3 C, totaling 2,000. Similarly, 333 1/3 C, plus 83 1/3 V, plus 83 1/3 S equal 500, and the same under S. The sum results in the total value of 3,000, as above. The entire constant capital value in the mass of commodities in Department 2, with the total value of 3,000, is thus contained in 2000 C, and neither 500 V nor 500 S contain a single atom of it. The same applies for V and S in their turn. In other words, the quota of Department 2's commodities that represents constant capital value, and is therefore reconvertible into this, whether in its natural or in its money form, is 2000 C. Everything relevant to the reconversion of the constant value of the commodities in Department 2 is therefore confined to the movement of 2002 C, and this reconversion can proceed only by exchange with Department 1's 1000 V plus 1000 S. Similarly, everything relevant to the reconversion of the constant value in Department 1 can be restricted to consideration of the 4001 C. Subsection A. Replacement of the depreciation component in the money form. Let us take, to start with, Department 1, 4000 C plus 1000 V plus 1000 S, and Department 2, 2000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S, where Department 1's 1000 V and 100 S factor into Department 2's 2000 C. If the commodities of 2002 C are exchanged for the commodities of the same value in 1001 V plus 1001 S, this assumes that 2002 C is completely reconverted in kind into the natural components of Department 2's constant capital that are replaced by Department 1. However, the commodity value of 2000, in which 2C exists, contains an element for depreciation of its fixed capital, which cannot be immediately replaced in kind but has to be transformed into money, its total sum accumulating bit by bit until the time falls due for the renewal of this fixed capital in its natural form. Each year is a mortal one for the fixed capital that has to be replaced in this or that particular business, or even this or that particular branch of industry. For a single individual capital, this or that part of its fixed capital has to be replaced, since its parts are of varying life. If we consider the annual reproduction, even on the same scale, i.e. abstracting from all accumulation, then we do not begin ab ovo. This is 1 year in the course of many, not capitalist production's year of birth. The various capitals invested in the manifold branches of production in Department 2 are therefore of different ages, and just as each year people functioning in these branches of production die, so each year do quantities of fixed capital reach the end of their life and have to be renewed in kind from the accumulated money fund. To this extent, the exchange of 2000 of Department 2C for 2000 of Department 1's V plus S involves the reconversion of 2002C from its commodity form, as means of consumption, back into the natural elements of constant capital that consist not only of raw materials and ancillaries, but also of the natural elements of fixed capital, machines, instruments, buildings, etc. The wear and tear that has to be replaced in money in the value of the 2002C thus in no way corresponds to the total scale of the fixed capital that is functioning, since each year a part of this has to be replaced in kind. This presupposes, however, that in earlier years, the money needed for this replacement was accumulated in the hands of the Department 2 capitalists. Precisely this assumption, however, holds just as much for the current year as it is assumed to hold for the previous years. In the exchange between Department 1's 1000V and 1000S and Department 2's 2000C, the first thing to note is that the sum of values of Department 1's V plus S does not contain any element of constant value, and thus no value element for the wear and tear to be replaced, i.e. for value that was transferred from the fixed component of the constant capital to the commodities in whose natural form V plus S exists. This element does exist, on the other hand, in 2C, and it is precisely a part of this value element attributable to the fixed capital that does not have to be directly transformed from the money form into the natural form, but has first rather to persist in the money form. The exchange between Department 1's 1000V and 1000S and Department 2's 2000C thus immediately presents the apparent difficulty that the means of production of Department 1, the natural form in which the 2000V plus S exists, have to be replaced to the entire amount of their value of 2000 by an equivalent in means of consumption of Department 2, whereas the means of consumption, 2000C of Department 2, cannot be exchanged to their full value for the means of production, Department 1's 1000V plus 1000S, since an aliquot part of their value, equal to the wear and tear or loss of the value of fixed capital, must first be precipitated out into money that does not function again as means of circulation within the current period of annual reproduction, which is all that is under consideration. But the money through which the element of wear and tear contained in the commodity value of 2002C is realized can derive only from Department 1, since Department 2 does not itself have to pay out, but is paid precisely by the sale of its commodities, and since, according to our assumption, Department 1's V plus S buys the entire sum of commodities 2002C. Department 1 must therefore realize this wear and tear for Department 2 by way of this sale. However, according to the law developed earlier, money advanced to circulation returns to the capitalist producer when he later casts the same amount into circulation in commodities. It is evidently impossible for Department 1, in purchasing 2C, to give Department 2 commodities worth 2,000, and to give it once and for all, on top of that, an extra amount of money, without any return of this money to it by the reconversion operation. Otherwise, the quota of commodities 2C would be sold above its value. If Department 2 does in fact exchange its 2000C for Department 1's 1000V and 1000S, it cannot demand anything more from Department 1, and the money circulating in this exchange returns to Department 1 or 2, depending on which of the two it was that cast it into circulation, i.e. which one first appeared as the buyer. At the same time, in this case, Department 2 would have transformed its commodity capital, to its full value, back into the natural form of means of production, whereas the assumption is that there is an aliquot part of this that it does not transform, after its sale, from money back into the natural form of fixed components of its constant capital during the current annual reproduction period. Thus, a balance in money could accrue to Department 2 only if 2 sold to Department 1 for 2,000, but bought from 1 for less than 2,000, for example, only 1,800. Department 1 would then have to make good the deficit by 200 in money, which would not flow back to it because it would not in turn have withdrawn this money advanced to circulation by throwing into circulation commodities to the value of 200. In this case, Department 2 would have a money fund against the wear and tear of its fixed capital. On the other side, however, that of Department 1, there would be an overproduction of means of production to the sum of 200, and in this way the whole basis of the schema would be destroyed, i.e. reproduction on the same scale, which presupposes complete proportionality between the various systems of production. One difficulty would have only been displaced by another, much more inconvenient one. Since this problem offers difficulties all its own and has not been dealt with at all by the political economists up to now, we intend to consider in succession all possible, or at least seemingly possible, solutions of the problem, or rather formulations of it. To start with, we just suppose that Department 2 sells 2,000 to Department 1, but only buys from Department 1 commodities for 1,800. The commodity value of 2002C then contains 200 for replacement of wear and tear, which is hoarded up in money. The value of 2002C would thus be broken down into 1,800, which is to be exchanged against means of production from Department 1, and 200 for the replacement of wear and tear, which is to be kept in money, after the sale of 2000C to Department 1. As far as its value goes, the 2002C would be 1,800C plus 200CD, where D stands for depreciation. We would then have to consider the exchange, Department 1, 1000V plus 1000S, Department 2, 1800C plus 200CD, where Department 1's 2000V plus S factor into Department 2's 1800C. Department 1 buys 1002C means of consumption from Department 2, with £1,000 that its workers have received for their labor power in payment of wages. The capitalists in Department 1 thereby receive their variable capital back in its money form, so that they can use it to buy labor power again next year for the same amount, i.e. to replace the variable part of their productive capital in kind. Department 2 also advances £400, say, to buy means of production 1S, and Department 1 uses the same £400, in which it has realized a part of its surplus value, to buy means of consumption 2C. The £400 advanced to the circulation sphere by Department 2 has thus returned to the capitalists in Department 2, but only as the equivalent for the commodities they have sold. Department 1 now advances £400 to buy means of consumption. Department 2 buys means of production for £400 from Department 1, and this £400 thereby flows back to Department 1. The account up to now is as follows. Department 1 is cast into circulation 1,000V plus 800S in commodities, and also cast into circulation in money £1,000 in wages and £400 for exchange with Department 2. After the exchange is completed, Department 1 has 1,000V in money, 800S converted into 802C, means of consumption, and £400 in money. Department 2 casts into circulation 1,800C in commodities, means of consumption, and £400 in money. After the exchange, it has 1,800 in commodities 1, means of production, and £400 in money. We then still have on Department 1's side 200S in means of production, and on Department 2's side 200CD in means of consumption. According to our assumption, Department 1 buys means of consumption CD to the value of 200 with £200 in money. This £200, however, Department 2 holds on to, since it represents 200 CD wear and tear, and is not to be directly converted back into means of production. Department 1's 200S is therefore unsaleable. 1/5 of the surplus value that Department 1 has to convert cannot be realized or converted from its natural form of means of production into that of means of consumption. This does not only contradict the assumption of reproduction on the same scale, it is in and of itself not the kind of hypothesis that could explain the realization of 200 CD. It says rather that this is inexplicable. Since there is no way of showing how the 200 CD is to be realized, we have to suppose that Department 1 is obliging enough to realize it, precisely because Department 1 is not in the position to realize its own remnant of 200S. To conceive this as a normal operation of the exchange mechanism would be the same as supposing that each year £200 rain down from heaven to realize the 200 CD. The absurdity of such a hypothesis, however, does not directly leap to the eye. If Department 1's S, instead of appearing as here in its original mode of existence, i.e. as a value component of means of production, a component of the value of commodities that their capitalist producers have to realize in money by selling them, appears in the hands of the capitalist co-partners, for example as ground rent in the hands of the landlord, or as interest in the hands of the moneylender. If the part of the surplus value in commodities that the industrial capitalist has to deduct as ground rent or interest for other persons with a claim on surplus value cannot be realized in the long run by the sale of the commodities themselves, there is then an end to the payment of rent and interest, and landlords or the recipients of interest cannot serve as deus ex machina for the arbitrary realization of certain portions of annual reproduction. It is just the same with the expenditure of all so-called unproductive workers, state officials, doctors, lawyers, etc., and others who, in the form of the general public, perform services for the political economists by explaining what they leave unexplained. It helps just as little if, instead of direct exchange between Departments 1 and 2, between the two great departments of capitalist production itself, the merchant is brought in as mediator to remove all difficulties with his money. In the given case, for example, 200 of Department 1's S must finally be disposed of to the industrial capitalists of Department 2. It may go through the hands of a whole series of merchants, but the last of these still finds himself in the same position vis-a-vis Department 2, according to our hypothesis, as the capitalist producers of Department 1 did at the beginning, i.e. they cannot sell the 200 of Department 1's S to Department 2, and as this sum of purchases has thus stuck fast, it prevents Department 1 from repeating the process. We see here how, apart from our specific purpose of considering the reproduction process in its fundamental form, setting aside all obscuring circumstances that intervene, it is necessary throughout to do away with the false subterfuges that provide a semblance of scientific explanation. If the process of social reproduction, in its intricate concrete form, is to become the object of our analysis, the law that, in the normal course of reproduction, whether simple or on an expanded scale, the money advanced to circulation by the capitalist producer must return to its starting point, it being immaterial here whether the money belongs to him or is borrowed, thus excludes, once and for all, the hypothesis that the 202 CD can be realized by the money advanced by Department 1. Subsection B. Replacement of the fixed capital in kind. After setting aside the hypothesis dealt with above, there still remain those possibilities which, besides the replacement of the wear and tear component in money, also bring in the replacement of the defunct fixed capital in kind. We assumed in the previous case, A, that £1,000 was paid by Department 1 in wages, and spent by the Department 1 workers on 2C to the same amount, i.e. that they used this to buy means of consumption. That the £1,000 was advanced by Department 1 in money is no more than a simple statement of fact. Wages are paid by the relevant capitalist producers in money. This money is then spent by the workers on means of subsistence and serves the sellers of these means of subsistence in turn as means of circulation for the conversion of their constant capital from the commodity capital into productive capital. It certainly runs through several channels: shopkeepers, landlords of dwelling houses, tax collectors, unproductive workers such as doctors, etc., that the worker himself needs, and it therefore flows only in part directly from the hands of the workers in Department 1 into those of the capitalist class in Department 2. The flow may, to a greater or lesser extent, stagnate, and new reserves of money may thus be needed on the part of the capitalists. All this can be omitted in considering the fundamental form. B. It was also assumed that at one point Department 1 advances a further £400 in money for purchases from Department 2, which later flows back to it, and at another point Department 2 advances £400 for purchases from Department 1, which similarly flows back to Department 2. This assumption must be made, since the opposite assumption, that only the capitalists in either Department 1 or 2 unilaterally advance to circulation the money needed for the exchange of commodities, would be arbitrary. Since we showed in subsection A that the hypothesis according to which Department 1 casts additional money into circulation in order to realize the 202 CD has to be rejected as absurd, we have left only the apparently still more absurd hypothesis that Department 2 itself casts into circulation the money with which the value component to commodities is realized, which has to replace the wear and tear of its fixed capital. The portion of value that Mr. X's spinning machine loses, in the course of production for example, reappears as a part of the value of his yarn. The loss that his spinning machine suffers in value, he thus collects on the other side as money. X might now, for example, buy cotton from Y for £200, and in this way advance £200 to the circulation sphere. Y buys yarn from him with the same £200, and this £200 now serves X as a fund for replacing the wear and tear of his spinning machine. What this boils down to is simply that X, apart from his production, its product, and the sale of this, keeps a further £200 stacked away in order to pay himself for the spinning machine's loss of value, i.e. that besides the £200 loss of value of his spinning machine, he has to add a further £200 money each year from his own pocket, so as finally to be in a position to buy a new spinning machine. The absurdity of this, however, is only apparent. Department 2 consists of capitalists whose fixed capital is at different points in its reproduction. For some, it has reached the point at which it has to be completely replaced in kind. For others, it is still more or less distant from this stage. What is common to all members of the latter division is that their fixed capital is not really reproduced, i.e. not renewed in kind or replaced by a new item of the same variety, but that its value is successively collected up in money. The first group of capitalists is in exactly the same situation as when they began their business, or almost so, it is all the same here, i.e. when they appeared on the market with a money capital in order to transform this on the one hand into constant capital, fixed and circulating, on the other hand into labor power, into variable capital. Just as at that time, they now have to advance this money capital once more to the circulation sphere, i.e. the value of the constant fixed capital as well as that of the circulating and that of the variable capital. If we assume, therefore, that out of the £400 that the capitalist class in Department 2 casts into circulation for the purpose of exchange with Department 1, half derives from those capitalists in Department 2 who not only have to renew in kind by the sale of their commodities, those of their means of production that form the circulating capital, but also have to renew with their money their fixed capital, while the other half of these capitalists in Department 2 renew only the circulating part of their constant capital in kind with their money, and do not renew their fixed capital, there is nothing contradictory in the fact that the £400 that flows back, and it flows back as soon as Department 1 buys means of consumption with it, is now divided differently between these two sections of Department 2. It flows back to Department 2. However, it does not flow back into the same hands, but is rather differently distributed within this class, passing from one section of it to the other. The first section of Department 2 has, besides the portion of means of production ultimately covered by its commodities, converted a further £200 in money into new elements of fixed capital in kind. The money it has spent in this way flows back to it from the circulation sphere only bit by bit over a series of years, just as at the start of business, in the shape of the depreciation components of the commodities to be produced with this fixed capital. The other section of Department 2, on the other hand, did not obtain any commodities from Department 1 with its £200. Instead, Department 1 pays it with the money with which the first section of Department 2 bought elements of fixed capital. One section of Department 2 has its fixed capital back in its renewed natural form. The other is still engaged in collecting it up in the money form, so as to replace its fixed capital in kind later on. The position from which we have to proceed, after the earlier exchanges, is the remnant of commodities to be exchanged on both sides. Department 1's 400S and Department 2's 400C. We assume that Department 2 advances £400 in money for the exchange of these commodities to the amount of £800. Half of this £400, being 200, must under all circumstances be laid out by the section of 2C that accumulates the £200 in money as the value of wear and tear, and which then has to transform this back again into the natural form of its fixed capital. Just as the constant capital value, variable capital value, and surplus value into which the value of both departments' commodity capital breaks down can be represented in proportionate quotas of the respective departments' commodities, so too can one represent, within the constant capital value itself, the portion of value that does not yet have to be converted into the natural form of fixed capital, but has for the time being to be gradually hoarded up in the money form. A certain quantity of Department 2's commodities, in our case, half of the remainder, being 200, are here no more than the bearers of this wear and tear value, which has to be precipitated out by conversion into money. The first group of capitalists in Department 2, who renew their fixed capital in kind, may have already realized a part of their wear and tear value in this way with the depreciation component of their total mass of commodities, of which we have here only the remnant, but there still remains 200 to be realized in money. As for the second half of the 400 cast into circulation by Department 2, in connection with this residual operation, this buys circulating components of constant capital from Department 1. Part of this £200 may be cast into circulation by each section of Department 2, or all by that section which does not renew its fixed value component in kind. The £400 is thus now used to withdraw from Department 1, commodities to the value of £200, which consists simply of elements of fixed capital, 2. Commodities to the total of £200, which simply replace in kind elements of the circulating part of the constant capital. Department 1 has now sold its entire annual commodity product, to the extent that this has to be sold to Department 2. The value of a fifth of it, £400, exists in its hands in the money form, but this money is realized surplus value and has to be spent as revenue on means of consumption. Department 1 therefore uses this £400 to buy the remaining commodity value of Department 2, being 400. The money flows back to Department 2 by removing commodities from that department. We shall now assume three different cases. Let us call the section of capitalists in Department 2 who replace their fixed capital in kind, Section 1, and those who store up the wear and tear value of their fixed capital in the money form, Section 2. The three cases are as follows. A. Out of the 400 that still remains as a residue of commodities in Department 2, a certain quota has to replace the quota of circulating parts of the constant capital for Sections 1 and 2, say half each. B. Section 1 has already sold its entire commodity, so that Section 2 still has 400 to sell. C. Section 2 has sold all except the 200 that carries the wear and tear value. We then have the following distributions. A. Of the commodity value 400C, the Department 2 still has in hand, Section 1 has 100 and Section 2 300. Out of this 300, 200 represents the wear and tear. In this case, out of the 400 the Department 1 sends back to obtain commodities from Department 2, Section 1 originally laid out £300, i.e. £200 in money with which it drew elements of fixed capital in kind from Department 1, and £100 in money to mediate its commodity exchange with Department 1. Section 2, on the other hand, advanced only a quarter of the £400, i.e. £100, also for the mediation of its commodity exchange with Department 1. Out of the £400 in money, Section 1 advanced £300 and Section 2 £100. This £400, however, flows back as follows. To Section 1, £100, i.e. only a third of the money it advanced. It possesses, however, for the other two-thirds, fixed capital to a value of 200. In return for this element of fixed capital to the value of 200, it is given money to Department 1, but not subsequently any commodity. As far as this 200 is concerned, Department 2 confronts Department 1 simply as a buyer, and not subsequently again as a seller. This money cannot then flow back to Section 1, otherwise this would have received its elements of fixed capital from Department 1 for nothing. As far as the last third of the money it advanced is concerned, Section 1 first appeared as a buyer of the circulating components of its constant capital. With the same money, Department 1 buys from it the remainder of its commodities to the value of 100. The money thus flows back to Section 1 of Department 2, because this section appears as a seller of commodities directly after having appeared as a buyer. If the money did not flow back to it, then Section 1 would firstly have given £100 in money to Department 1 for commodities to a value of 100, and then a further 100 in commodities to the bargain, i.e. it would have given its commodities away as a present. Section 2, on the other hand, which laid out £100 in money, receives a reflux of £300. £100 because it firstly casts 100 in money into the circulation sphere as a buyer and receives this back as a seller, and £200 because it functions only as a seller of commodities to the amount of 200, and not also as a buyer to this amount. Thus, the money cannot flow back to Department 1. The wear and tear of the fixed capital is therefore paid for by the money cast into circulation by Department 2, Section 1, in the purchase of elements of fixed capital, but it does not come into Section 2's hands as the money of Section 1, but rather as money belonging to Department 1. B. On this assumption, The remnant of 2C is distributed in such a way that Section 1 has only £200 in money, and Section 2 the £400 in commodities. Section 1 has sold all its commodities, but the £200 in money is the changed form of the fixed component of its constant capital, which it has to renew in kind. It appears here, therefore, simply as a buyer, and in place of its money, receives commodities from Department 1 to the same amount of the natural elements of fixed capital. Section 2 has, as a maximum, to cast into circulation only £200, since for half the value of its commodities, it only sells to Department 1 and does not buy from it, if no money is advanced by Department 1 for the commodity exchange between Departments 1 and 2. £400 then returns to Section 2 from the circulation sphere, £200 because it advanced this as a buyer and receives it back as a seller of commodities to the value of £200, and the other £200 because it sold commodities to Department 1 to the value of £200, without withdrawing an equivalent in value for these from Department 1. C. Section 1 possesses £200 in money and 200C in commodities. Section 2 has 200D in commodities. On this assumption, Section 2 does not have to advance anything in money because it no longer functions at all as a buyer vis-a-vis Department 1, but rather only as a seller, and thus has to wait until its goods are bought. Section 1 advances £400 in money, £200 for the mutual commodity exchange with Department 1, £200 as a mere buyer from it. With this latter £200 in money, it buys elements of fixed capital. Department 1 uses £200 to buy 200 commodities from Section 1, and it is therefore to Section 1 that the £200 advanced in money for this commodity exchange returns. Department 1 uses the other £200, which it has also obtained from Section 1, to buy commodities worth $200 from Section 2, which thereby has the wear and tear of its fixed capital precipitated out in money. The situation would be in no way changed if it were assumed that, in case C, it was Department 1 instead of Department 2 Section 1 that advanced the £200 in money for the exchange of the existing values. If Department 1 first buys commodities from Department 2 Section 2 for £200, we have assumed that this section only has to sell the remnant of its commodities, then the £200 does not return to Department 1, since Department 2 Section 2 no longer appears as a buyer, but Department 2 Section 1 then has £200 in money to buy with and a further 200 in commodities to be exchanged, thus a total of 400 to be exchanged with Department 1. £200 in money then returns to Department 1 from Department 2 Section 2. If Department 1 lays this out again in order to buy the 200 in commodities from Department 2 Section 1, then this returns to it when Department 2 Section 1 receives the second half of Department 1's 400 commodities. Section 1 of Department 2 has laid out £200 in money simply as the buyer of elements of fixed capital. This does not return to it, but rather serves to realize in money the residual 200C of commodities from Department 2 Section 2, while the money laid out for commodity exchange, £200, flows back to Department 1, not via Department 2 Section 2, but rather via 2 Section 1. For its commodities of 400, an equivalent in commodities to the sum of 400 is returned to it. The £200 in money it advanced for the conversion of the 800 commodities has similarly returned to it, and so everything is in order. The difficulty that emerged in connection with the exchange, Department 1, 1000V plus 1000S, for Department 2's 2000C, was reduced to the difficulty in converting the remnants, Department 1, 400S, and Department 2, Section 1, 200 money plus 200C commodities, plus Section 2, 200C commodities. Or to make the matter still clearer, Department 1, 200S plus 200S, and Department 2, Section 1, 200 money plus 200C commodities, plus Department 2's 200C commodities. Since 200C in commodities in Department 2, Section 1 is exchanged for 201S commodities, and since all the money that circulates for this exchange of 400 in commodities between Departments 1 and 2 returns to the department which advanced it, whether 1 or 2, this money, as an element of the exchange between Departments 1 and 2, is in fact not an element of our present problem. To put it another way, if we assume that in this exchange between 201S, commodities, and 202C, commodities of Department 2, Section 1, the money functions as means of payment and not as means of purchase, and thus not as means of circulation in the strictest sense, then it is evident that since the commodities 201S and 202C Section 1 are of equal value, and means of production to a value of 200 are exchanged for means of consumption to a value of 200, the money functions here only ideally. And no money really has to be cast into the circulation sphere to settle the balance, either by one side or the other. The problem, therefore, emerges in its pure form only if we cancel out the commodities 201S on the side of Department 1 and their equivalent commodities 202C, Section 1, on the side of Department 2. After eliminating these two amounts of commodities of the same value, of Departments 1 and 2, that mutually balance each other, the remnant to be exchanged, in which the problem emerges in its pure form, remains as follows. Department 1, 200S in commodities, and Department 2, Section 1, 200C in money, plus Section 2's 200C in commodities. It is clear that Department 2, Section 1 buys the components of its fixed capital 201S with £200 in money, The fixed capital Department 1, a value of 200, is transformed from the commodity form, as means of production and indeed elements of fixed capital, into the money form. With this money, Department 1 buys means of consumption from Department 2, Section 2, and the result for Department 2 is that Section 1 has been able to renew a fixed component of its constant capital in kind, and that Section 2 has another component, which replaces the wear and tear of its fixed capital, precipitated out in money. This continues each year until this component too is due to be replaced in kind. The precondition here is evidently that the fixed component to Department 2's constant capital, which in any given year has been transformed back into money to its full value and thus has to be renewed in kind, in Section 1, has to be equal to the annual wear and tear of the other fixed component to the constant capital in Department 2, which still goes on functioning in its old natural form, and whose wear and tear, the loss of value that it transfers to the commodity in whose production it is involved, has first to be replaced in money. Such a balance accordingly appears as a law of reproduction on the same scale, which means, in other words, that the proportionate division of labor in Department 1, where means of production are produced, must remain unaltered, insofar as it supplies on the one hand circulating and on the other hand fixed components of the constant capital Department 2. Before we investigate this more closely, we must first see how the matter stands if the residual amount of 2C, Section 1, is not equal to the remnant of 2C of Section 2. It may be greater or less, and so we shall examine each case separately. First case. Department 1, 200S, Department 2, Section 1, 220C in money, plus Section 2's 200C in commodities. Here, 2C, Section 1, buys commodities 201S for 200 pounds in money, and Department 1 uses the same money to buy commodities 202C, Section 2, i.e. the component of fixed capital that has to be precipitated out in money. The latter is thereby realized. But 2C Section 1 in money cannot be transformed back into fixed capital in kind. It might seem that this unfortunate state of affairs can be rectified if we take the remnant of 1S as 220 instead of 200, so that out of the 2,000 of Department 1, only 1,780 instead of 1,800 have been disposed of by earlier exchange. In this case, we have Department 1, 220S, Department 2, Section 1, 220C in money, plus Section 2's 200C in commodities. Department 2, Section 1 buys the 221S for 220 pounds in money, and Department 1 then buys the 202C Section 2 in commodities for 200 pounds. But there is still the 20 pounds on the side of Department 1, a piece of surplus value that it can only hold on to in money, and cannot spend on means of consumption. The difficulty is only shifted from 2C Section 1 to 1S. If we now assume, on the other hand, that 2C Section 1 is smaller than 2C Section 2, then we have the second case. Department 1, 200S in commodities. Department 2, Section 1, 180C in money, and Section 2, 200C in commodities. Department 2, Section 1 buys commodities 181S for 180 pounds in money. Department 1 uses this money to buy commodities to the same value from Department 2, Section 2, i.e. 182C Section 2. There remains an unsaleable 21S on the other side, and similarly 22C Section 2 on the other. Commodities to the value of 40 that cannot be transformed into money. It would not be any use to take the remnant in Department 1 as 180. There would certainly not be any longer a surplus in Department 1, but there would still be an unsaleable surplus in 2C Section 2, one which could not be transformed into money. In the first case, where Department 2, Section 1 is bigger than Department 2, Section 2, there remains on the side of 2C, Section 1, a surplus in money which cannot be transformed into fixed capital, or if the remnant 1S is taken as equal to 2C, Section 1, the same surplus in money on the part of 1S, which cannot be transformed into means of consumption. In the second case, where 2C1 is smaller than 2C2, there remains a monetary deficit on the part of both the 201S and the 2C2, and the same surplus in commodities on the two sides, or if the remnant 1S is taken as equal to 2C1, a deficit in money and a surplus in commodities on the part of 2C2. If we take the remnant 1S as always equal to 2C1, since production is determined by orders, and it does not alter the reproduction in any way if this year more components of fixed capital, and next year more components of circulating capital are produced by Department 1 for Department 2's constant capital, then in the first case, 1S could be transformed back into means of consumption only if Department 1 bought it with a part of the surplus value Department 2, so that instead of being consumed, this was accumulated by Department 2 as money. In the second case, it would only help if Department 1 spent the money itself, i.e. the hypothesis that we rejected. If 2C1 is bigger than 2C2, then an import of foreign commodities is needed in order to realize the monetary surplus in 1S. If 2C1 is less than 2C2, Then conversely, an export of commodities to Department 2, that is means of consumption, is needed to realize the wear and tear component in 2C and means of production. In both cases, foreign trade is necessary. Even if we assume, in considering reproduction on a constant scale, that the productivity of all branches of industry, and thus also the proportionate value ratios of their commodity products, remains constant, the two cases last mentioned, in which 2C1 is greater or less than 2C2, would still be of interest for production on an expanded scale, where they will inevitably arise. Subsection C. Results. As far as the replacement of the fixed capital is concerned, the following general points can be made. Suppose that all other circumstances remain the same, i.e. not only the scale of production but also and particularly the productivity of labor. Then, if a greater part of the fixed element of 2C becomes defunct than it did the previous year, and therefore a greater part has to be renewed in kind, that portion of fixed capital that is as yet only en route to its demise and has to be replaced in money for the time being until it actually does expire, must decline in the same proportion, since, according to our assumption, the sum, including the value sum, of the portion of fixed capital functioning in Department 2 remains the same. This, however, brings about the following situation. Firstly, if a greater part of Department 1's commodity capital consists of elements of the fixed capital of 2C, then the circulating component for 2C is so much the less, since the total amounts that Department 1 produces for 2C remains unchanged. If one part increases, then the other must decline, and vice versa. On the other hand, however, the total production of Department 2 also remains the same. But how is this possible if its raw materials, work in progress, and ancillary materials decrease, i.e. the circulating elements of constant capital in Department 2? Secondly, a greater part of the fixed capital 2C, restored in the money form, flows to Department 1 to be changed back from the money form into the natural form. Thus, additional money accrues to Department 1, besides the money that circulates simply to exchange commodities between 1 and 2, money that does not mediate reciprocal commodity exchange but appears in its unilateral function as means of purchase. At the same time, however, the quantity of commodities 2C that bears the replacement value, the wear and tear, would be proportionately reduced, i.e. the quantity of commodities in Department 2 that does not have to be exchanged against commodities from Department 1, but only against Department 1's money. More money from Department 2 would flow to Department 1 as mere means of purchase, and there would be fewer commodities from Department 2 towards which Department 1 had to function merely as buyer. A greater part of 1S, for 1V has already been converted into Department 2's commodities, would thus not be convertible into commodities 2, and would be held fast in the money form. We do not need here to go any further into the opposite case, where the reproduction of the defunct fixed capital in Department 2 was less in 1 year and the wear and tear component greater. There would be a crisis of production, despite reproduction on a constant scale. In short, if in the case of simple reproduction, and with other circumstances remaining the same, i.e. particularly with the productivity, overall amount and intensity of labor remaining unchanged, a constant proportion is not assumed between the defunct fixed capital, that needing renewal, and the fixed capital which continues to operate in the old natural form, merely adding value to its products to replace its wear and tear, then in one case, the amount of circulating components to be reproduced remains the same, but the amount of fixed components to be replaced will have increased, and the total production of Department 1 therefore has to grow, or else there would be an insufficient amount of reproduction quite independent of the monetary relations. In the other case, if the proportionate size of the fixed capital in Department 2 that has to be reproduced in kind declines, then the amount of constant capital 2's circulating components that have been reproduced by Department 1 remains unchanged, while the fixed components to be reproduced have declined. There is thus either a reduction in the total production of Department 1, or alternatively, a surplus, as previously a deficit, a surplus that cannot be realized. The same labor can certainly supply in the first case a greater product with increased productivity, extension, or intensity, and in this way, the deficit in the first case could be covered. But a change of this kind could not occur without a shift of labor and capital from one branch of production in Department 1 to another, and any displacement of this kind would produce momentary dislocations. Secondly, however, insofar as extension and intensification of labor increase, Department 1 would have more value to exchange for less value from Department 2, i.e. Department 1's product would depreciate. The reverse happens in the second case, where Department 1 has either to contract its production, which means a crisis for the workers and capitalists engaged in it, or to supply a surplus, which again leads to crisis. Of themselves, these surpluses are no evil, rather an advantage. In capitalist production, however, they are an evil. Foreign trade could help in both cases. In the first, to exchange for means of consumption the commodities from Department 1 which are held fast in the money form, in the second, to dispose of the surplus commodities. But foreign trade, insofar as it does not just replace elements and their value, only shifts the contradictions to a broader sphere and gives them a wider orbit. Once we dispense with the capitalist form of reproduction, then the whole problem boils down to the fact that the magnitude of the part of fixed capital that becomes defunct, and has therefore to be replaced in kind, varies in successive years. Here we are dealing simply with a fixed capital functioning in the production of means of consumption. If it is very large one year, if the mortality is above the average, just as with human beings, then in the following years it will certainly be so much the less. The mass of raw materials, work in progress, and ancillaries needed for the annual production of means of consumption, assuming that other circumstances remain the same, does not diminish on this account, and so the total production of the means of production would have to increase in one case and decrease in the other. This can only be remedied by perpetual relative overproduction. On the one hand, a greater quantity of fixed capital is produced than is directly needed. On the other hand, and this is particularly important, a stock of raw materials, etc. is produced that surpasses the immediate annual need. This is particularly true means of subsistence. Overproduction of this kind is equivalent to control by the society over the objective means of its own reproduction. Within capitalist society, however, it is an anarchic element. This example of fixed capital, in the context of reproduction on a constant scale, is a striking one. A disproportionate production of fixed and circulating capital is a factor much favored by the economists in their explanation of crises. It is something new to them that a disproportion of this kind can and must arise from the mere maintenance of the fixed capital, that it can and must arise on the assumption of an ideal normal production, with simple reproduction of the social capital already functioning. Section 12. The reproduction of the money material. One factor has so far been completely disregarded, namely the annual reproduction of gold and silver. As the mere raw material for luxury articles, for gold and silver plating, etc., these would no more need special mention here than any other products. However, they play an important role as money material and hence as potential money. For the sake of simplification, we take gold to be the sole money material here. According to earlier figures, the world's total annual gold production amounted to some 800,000 to 900,000 pounds, i.e. between 1,100 and 1,250 million marks. According to Subdivision, however, the average for the years between 1871 and 1875 was only 170,674 kilograms, or a value of approximately 476 million marks. Australia supplied around 167 million marks worth, the USA 166 million, and Russia 93 million. The remainder was divided between the various countries in amounts of less than 10 million marks each. The annual silver production, during the same period, amounted to something under 2 million kilos, with a value of 354.5 million marks, of which Mexico supplied about 108 million marks worth, the USA 102, South America 67, Germany 26, etc. Of the countries in which capitalist production is dominant, only the USA is a producer of gold and silver. The European capitalist countries receive almost all their gold, and by far the greater portion of their silver, from Australia, the USA, Mexico, South America, and Russia. However, we propose to put gold mines into the country of capitalist production whose annual reproduction we are analyzing here, for the following reason. Capitalist production never exists without foreign trade. If normal annual reproduction on a given scale is presupposed, then it is also supposed, together with this, that foreign trade replaces domestic articles only by those of other use or natural forms, without affecting the value ratios, and therefore without affecting either the value ratios in which the two categories, means of production and means of consumption, mutually exchange for one another, or the ratios between the constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value, into which the value of the product of each of these categories can be broken down. Bringing foreign trade into an analysis of the value of the product annually reproduced can therefore only confuse things, without supplying any new factor either to the problem or to its solution. We therefore completely abstract from it here, and treat gold as a direct element of the annual reproduction, not as a commodity imported from abroad by exchange. The production of gold belongs, along with metal production in general, to Department 1, the category which comprises the production of means of production. We intend to assume that the annual gold product is equal to 30, for convenience only, as this is in fact far too high in relation to the other figures in our schema. This value can be broken down into 20C plus 5V plus 5S. The 20C is to be exchanged against other elements of Department 1C, and this will be considered below. See page 548, note 14. The 5V and 5S, however, has to be exchanged against elements of 2C, i.e. means of consumption. As far as the 5V is concerned, every gold-producing business first begins by buying labor power, not with the gold it has itself produced, but with an adequate part of the money already in stock in the country. The workers use this V to withdraw means of consumption from Department 2, and Department 2 uses it to buy materials of production from Department 1. Let us say that Department 2 buys gold worth 2 from Department 1 as a commodity material, etc., a component of its constant capital, so that 2V flows back to the gold producers in Department 1 in money that already belonged earlier to the circulation sphere. If Department 2 buys nothing more in gold material from Department 1, the gold producers there still buy from 2, inasmuch as they cast their gold into circulation here as money, since gold can buy every commodity. The difference is simply that Department 1 does not appear here as a seller, but only as a buyer. The gold diggers in Department 1 can always get rid of their commodity, which always exists in a directly exchangeable form. Let us assume that a cotton spinner has paid his workers 5V, and that these supply him, leaving aside his surplus value, with spun yarn, equal to 5. The workers then buy Department 2C commodities to the value of 5, and Department 2 buys yarn from Department 1 for 5 in money, so that the 5V flows back in money to the cotton spinner. In the case assumed here, on the other hand, Department 1G, as we shall denote the gold producers, advances 5V to its workers, in money which already belonged earlier to the circulation sphere. These spend the money on means of subsistence, but out of this 5, only 2 returns from Department 2 back to 1G. 1G, however, can begin the reproduction process again just as well as the cotton spinner can, as its workers have supplied it with 5 in gold. 2 of this has been sold, and it still has 3 left in gold, which therefore only has to be coined, or transformed into banknotes, for its whole variable capital to exist again in its hands in the money form, without any further mediation by Department 2. Even in this first process of annual reproduction, however, a change has taken place in the quantity of money actually or virtually belonging to the circulation sphere. We assume that Department 2's constant capital bought 2V, being 1G, as material, and that 1G laid out 3 again in Department 2 as the money form of variable capital. Thus, the value of 3 that remained within Department 2 and did not flow back to Department 1 comes from the sum of money supplied by the new gold production. According to our assumption, Department 2 has satisfied its need for gold material. The 3 remains in its hands as a gold hoard. It cannot form any element of its constant capital, and Department 2 already had sufficient money capital to purchase labor power. Furthermore, with the exception of the wear and tear element, this additional 3G has no function to perform within 2C, for a part of which it was exchanged. It could only serve to meet a proportionate part of the wear and tear element if 2C1 were smaller than 2C2, which would be accidental. On the other hand, however, even with the exception of the wear and tear element, the entire commodity product 2C has to be exchanged for means of production 1V plus S. Hence, this money must be completely transferred from 2C to 2S, whether this exists in necessary means of subsistence or in luxury items, and the corresponding commodity value must be transferred, conversely, from 2S to 2C. The result is that a part of the surplus value is stored away as a money hoard. In the second year's reproduction, if the same proportion of the gold annually produced continues to be used as money, 2 will once again flow back to 1G and 3 will be replaced in kind, i.e. will be set free again in Department 2 as a hoard, etc. As far as the variable capital is concerned, we can say generally that capitalist 1G, just like any other, always has to advance this capital in money for the purchase of labor power. As far as this V is concerned, it is not he but his workers who have to buy from Department 2. Thus, the case in which he appears as a buyer and casts gold into Department 2 can never arise unless the latter takes the initiative. But insofar as Department 2 buys material from him and needs to convert its constant capital, 2C, into gold material, part of 1GV flows back to him from Department 2 in the same way as to the other capitalists in Department 1. To the extent that this is not the case, he directly replaces his V in gold from his own product. But in the proportion to which the V advanced as money does not flow back to him from Department 2, a part of it that had already been advanced to the circulation sphere is transformed into a hoard. This part is the money that flowed to him from Department 1 and did not return there, and a part of his surplus value is therefore not spent on means of consumption. As new gold mines are constantly opened, or old ones reopened, so a definite proportion of the money that 1G has to lay out on V is always part of the quantity of money in existence before the new gold production. It was cast into Department 2 by way of its workers, and to the extent that it does not return to 1G from Department 2, it forms an element of hoard formation there. As far as 1GS is concerned, 1G can always appear here as a buyer. It casts its S into the circulation sphere as gold, and correspondingly withdraws means of consumption 2C. Here, the gold is partly used as material and hence functions as a real element of the constant component C of Department 2's productive capital, and inasmuch as this is not the case, it again becomes an element of hoard formation as a part of 2G that persists in money. It is clear, even leaving aside the 1C, which will be considered later, that even simple reproduction, which excludes accumulation in the strict sense of the term, i.e. reproduction on an expanded scale, necessarily involves the storage of money, or hoard formation. And since this is repeated again each year, it explains the assumption from which we proceeded in considering capitalist production, namely that at the beginning of the reproduction process, the capitalists in Departments 1 and 2 must each already possess a quantity of the monetary medium which corresponds to the amount of commodity exchange. There is even storage of this kind after deduction of the gold lost by the abrasion of the money in circulation. It is self-evident that the greater the maturity of capitalist production, the greater is the quantity of money accumulated on all sides, and the smaller, therefore, the proportion that the new gold production of each year adds to this quantity, even though this addition may be quite significant in absolute terms. We come back once again, then, in general terms, to the objection made against Tuch, see page 404 above. How is it possible for each capitalist to withdraw a surplus value from the annual product in money, i.e. to withdraw more money from the circulation sphere than he cast into it, since in the final analysis, the capitalist class itself must be seen as the origin of all money in circulation? We note on this point, by way of summary of what has already been developed earlier, see chapter 17, 1. The only assumption required here is that there should always be sufficient money to convert the various elements of the commodity mass annually reproduced. This is in no way affected by the fact that a part of the commodity value consists of surplus value. If the whole of production belonged to the workers themselves, then their surplus labor would be surplus labor for themselves and not for the capitalists. But the mass of commodity value in circulation would be the same and would require, given that other circumstances also remained the same amount of money for its circulation. The question in both cases is simply, where does the money come from to convert this total commodity value? It is not, where does the money come from to realize the surplus value? Moreover, to come back to this once again, each individual commodity consists of C plus V plus S, and so a certain sum of money is necessary for the circulation of the capital C plus V, and another sum of money is needed for the circulation of the capitalist revenue, the surplus value S. Just as for the individual capitalist, so for the class as a whole, the money in which it advances capital is different from the money in which it spends revenue. Where does this latter money come from? Simply from the fact that the mass of money that exists in the hands of the capitalist class, which is by and large the total quantity of money that exists in society, one part circulates the capitalist revenue. We already saw above how each capitalist who sets up a new business fishes back the money that he spends on means of consumption for his own maintenance, once the business is underway, in the shape of money which serves to realize his surplus value. Generally speaking, however, the whole difficulty arises from two sources, as follows. Firstly, if we consider simply the circulation sphere and the turnover of capital, i.e. consider the capitalist simply as the personification of capital, not also as capital as consumer and man of the world, then although we certainly see him constantly casting surplus value into circulation as a component of his commodity capital, we never see money in his hands as a form of revenue. We never see him casting money into circulation for the consumption of his surplus value. Secondly, if the capitalist class casts a certain sum of money into circulation in the shape of revenue, it appears as if it paid an equivalent for this part of the total annual product, and that this has thereby ceased to represent surplus value. But the surplus product in which the surplus value is represented costs the capitalist class nothing. As a class, it possesses it and enjoys it free of charge, and the monetary circulation cannot alter this in any way. The change that this brings about simply consists in the fact that each capitalist, instead of consuming his own surplus product in kind, for which in most cases it would not be suitable, withdraws commodities of all kinds from the total stock to the amount of the surplus value that he appropriated, and appropriates these. The circulation mechanism, however, has shown that if the capitalist class casts money into circulation to be spent as revenue, it withdraws the same money again from circulation, and so the same process can always begin again. Considered as a capitalist class, therefore, it remains now as before in possession of this sum of money needed for the realization of its surplus value. If the capitalist not only withdraws surplus value from the commodity market in the form of commodities for his consumption fund, but at the same time the money with which he buys these commodities flows back to him, he has evidently withdrawn the commodities from circulation without an equivalent. They cost him nothing, even though he pays for them with money. If I buy commodities for £1 sterling, and the seller of these commodities gives me back my £1 in exchange for a surplus product that cost me nothing, then I have obviously received the commodities for nothing. The constant repetition of this operation in no way alters the fact that I constantly withdraw commodities and constantly remain in possession of the £1, even though I part with it temporarily in order to obtain these commodities. The capitalist constantly receives this money back as the realization of surplus value that cost him nothing. We saw that for Adam Smith, the entire value of the social product resolved itself into revenue, into V plus S, and that the value of the constant capital was therefore taken as zero. It necessarily follows from this that the money required for the circulation of the annual revenue would also be sufficient for the circulation of the entire annual product, and that in our case, therefore, the money needed for the circulation of means of consumption to the value of 3,000 would be sufficient for the circulation of a total annual product to the value of 9,000. This was in fact Adam Smith's opinion, and it is repeated by Thomas Tuch. This false conception of the ratio between the quantity of money needed to realize revenue and the quantity of money that circulates the total social product is a necessary result of the uncomprehending, thoughtless manner in which they view the reproduction and annual replacement of the different material and value elements of the total annual product. It is therefore already refuted. Let us listen to Smith and Tuch themselves. Smith says, in Book 2, Chapter 2, quote, "The circulation of every country may be considered as divided into two different branches, the circulation of the dealers with one another and the circulation between the dealers and the consumers. Though the same pieces of money, whether paper or metal, may be employed sometimes in one circulation and sometimes in the other, yet, as both are constantly going on at the same time, each requires a certain stock of money of one kind or another to carry it on. The value of the goods circulated between the different dealers never can exceed the value of those circulated between the dealers and the consumers. Whatever is bought by the dealers being ultimately destined to be sold to the consumers. The circulation between the dealers, as it is carried on by wholesale, requires generally a pretty large sum for every particular transaction. That between the dealers and the consumers, on the contrary, as it is generally carried on by retail, frequently requires but very small ones, a shilling or even a halfpenny being often sufficient. But small sums circulate much faster than large ones. Though the annual purchases of all consumers, therefore, are at least, this at least is a good one, equal in value to those of all the dealers, they can generally be transacted with a much smaller quantity of money." End quote. On this passage of our Adams, Thomas Tuch remarks, quote, "There can be no doubt that the distinction here made is substantially correct. The interchange between dealers and consumers, including the payment of wages, which constitute the principal means of the consumers, all the transactions between dealers and dealers, by which are to be understood all sales from the producer or importer, through all the stages of intermediate processes of manufacture or otherwise to the retail dealer or the exporting merchant, are resolvable into the movements or transfers of capital. Now, transfers of capital do not necessarily suppose, nor do actually, as a matter of fact, entail, the great majority of transactions. A passing of money, that is, banknotes or coin, I mean bodily and not by fiction, at the time of transfer. The total amount of the transactions between dealers and dealers must, in the last resort, be determined and limited by the amount of those between dealers and consumers." End quote from an inquiry into the currency principle, published in London in 1844. If we took this last sentence by itself, we might believe Tuch was simply claiming that there was a certain ratio between the transactions between dealers and those between dealers and consumers. In other words, between the value of the total annual revenue and the value of the capital with which it is produced. But this is not the case. He expressly endorses the Smithian conception. A special criticism of his circulation theory would thus be superfluous. 2. Every industrial capital, at its outset, casts money into circulation all at once for the entire fixed component of its capital, and it recovers this only gradually over a series of years by the sale of its annual product. It therefore casts more money into the circulation sphere at first than it withdraws from this. This is repeated each time that the entire capital is renewed in kind. It is repeated each year for a certain number of businesses. Those whose fixed capital has to be renewed in kind. It is repeated partially with each repair, with each fractional renewal of the fixed capital. If at one point more money is withdrawn from the circulation than is cast in, the reverse is the case at another point. In all branches of industry whose production periods, as distinct from their working periods, extend over a relatively long time, money is constantly cast into circulation by the capitalist producers during this period, partly in payment for the labor power applied, partly for purchasing the means of production that are to be used. Means of production are therefore withdrawn from the commodity market directly, and means of consumption in part indirectly, by the workers when they spend their wages, and in part also directly by the capitalists themselves, who in no way suspend their consumption even though they do not cast into the market at the same time an equivalent in commodities. During this period, the money that the capitalist casts into circulation serves to realize commodity value, including the surplus value contained in it. This factor becomes very important in developed capitalist production, in connection with the long drawn-out enterprises undertaken by joint stock companies, etc. such as the building of railways, canals, docks, large municipal buildings, the construction of iron ships, the draining of land on a large scale, etc. 3. While the other capitalists, apart from their outlay on fixed capital, withdraw more money from the circulation sphere than they cast into it for the purchase of labor power and the circulating elements, the gold and silver producing capitalists cast only money into circulation, leaving aside the portion of precious metal serving as raw material, while they withdraw only commodities from it. Their constant capital, with the exception of the wear and tear component, the greater part of their variable capital, and their entire surplus value, with the exception of a certain hoard that is accumulated in their own hands, is cast into the circulation sphere as money. 4. It is certainly true that all kinds of things circulate as commodities that were not produced within the year. Plots of land, houses, etc., as well as products whose production period extends over longer than a year, such as cattle, wood, wine, etc. It is important to establish for these and other phenomena that besides the sum of money required for direct circulation, there is always a certain quantity in a latent and non-functioning state, which can come out and function on a given impulse. The value of these products also often circulates bit by bit and gradually. For example, the value of houses circulates in rent over a series of years. On the other hand, not all the motions of the reproduction process are mediated by money circulation. The entire production process falls outside it, once its elements have been procured. So do all products that the producer directly consumes himself, whether individually or productively, including the provisions paid in kind to agricultural workers. Thus, the quantity of money that circulates the annual product is present in society and has been accumulated bit by bit. It does not form part of the value product of the present year, with the possible exception of the gold that replaces worn-out coins. In this presentation, we have presupposed the exclusive circulation of precious metals as money, and together with this, the simplest form of cash purchases and sales. Though even on the basis of simple metallic circulation, money can function also as a means of payment and actually has functioned in this way historically, and a system of credit and certain aspects of the credit mechanism have developed on that basis. This assumption was made not simply for methodological reasons, although the importance of these is shown by the simple fact that both Tuke and his school, and their opponents, were constantly forced in their controversies over the circulation of banknotes to come back again to the hypothesis of pure metallic circulation. They were forced to do this post festum, but then they did so very superficially, and necessarily so since this starting point fulfilled only an incidental function in their analysis. However, the simplest consideration of monetary circulation in the form in which it develops spontaneously, and this monetary circulation is here an imminent moment of the annual process of reproduction, shows the following. A. On the assumption of developed capitalist production, i.e. the domination of the system of wage labor, money capital evidently plays a major role, inasmuch as it is the form in which variable capital is advanced. To the degree that the wage system develops, all products are transformed into commodities, and all, with a few important exceptions, must therefore jointly undergo the transformation into money as a phase in their development. The quantity of money in circulation must be sufficient for the realization of the commodities, and the greater part of this is supplied in the form of wages, of money that is advanced by the industrial capitalists in payment of labor power and mainly functions in the hands of the workers only as a means of circulation, that is, means of purchase. This is in complete contrast to natural economy, such as predominates on the basis of every form of personal bondage, including serfdom, and still more so on the basis of more or less primitive communities, whether or not these involve relations of bondage or slavery. In the slave system, the money capital laid out on the purchase of labor power plays the role of fixed capital in the money form, and is only gradually replaced as the active life of the slave comes to an end. This is why in Athens, the profit that a slave owner drew, either directly from the industrial use of his slave or indirectly by renting the slave to other industrial users, for example for work in the mines, was simply considered as interest, together with amortization. Just as in capitalist production, the industrial capitalist puts a portion of his surplus value down in his accounts together with the wear and tear of his fixed capital, as interest and replacement for the fixed capital. This is also the rule with capitalists who rent out fixed capital, houses, machines, etc. Mere domestic slaves, whether they are used to perform necessary services or simply as a display of luxury, are not considered here. They correspond to our servant class. But even the slave system, inasmuch as it was the dominant form of productive labor in agriculture, manufacture, shipbuilding, etc., as in the developed Greek states and in Rome, retains an element of natural economy. The slave market itself constantly receives supplies of the commodity labor power from war, piracy, etc., and this pillage is not mediated by a process of circulation, but is rather the appropriation in kind of other people's labor power by direct physical compulsion. Even in the USA, after the border area between wage labor states of the North and the slave states of the South had been transformed into a slave breeding zone for the South, and where the slave thrown onto the market had therefore himself become an element of the annual reproduction, this was, for a long while, insufficient, and the African slave trade had to be carried on for as long as possible in order to fill the requirements of the market. B. The fluxes and refluxes of money which take place on the basis of capitalist production, for the reconversion of the annual product, and which have grown up spontaneously, the advances of fixed capital at a single stroke to its entire value, and the progressive withdrawal of this value from circulation by a process that extends over a period of many years, i.e. its gradual reconstitution in the money form by annual hoard formation, a hoard formation that is completely different in nature from the hoard formation based on the new gold production of each year that accompanies it, the different lengths of time for which money has to be advanced, which vary according to the length of the production periods of the commodities, and for which there has to be, in each case, a prior formation of a hoard before the money can be withdrawn from circulation by the sale of the commodity involved. The varying times of advance that arise simply from differences in the distance of the point of production from the market outlet, as well as the variation in the size and period of the reflux according to the condition or the relative size of the production stocks in different businesses, and for the different individual capitalists in the same line of business, i.e. the dates of purchase of the elements of constant capital, and all this during the year's reproduction, all these different aspects of the spontaneous movement had only to be noted and brought to light by experience in order to give rise both to a methodical use of the mechanical aids of the credit system and to the actual fishing out of available loan capital. On top of all this, there is still the distinction between businesses whose production proceeds continuously on the same scale, as long as conditions remain otherwise the same, and those that employ labor power in different degrees at different periods of the year, such as agriculture. Section 13. Destutt de Tracy's theory of reproduction. The great logician Destutt de Tracy will serve as an example of the confused and at the same time boastful incomprehension shown by the political economists in dealing with the social reproduction. Here is a man whom even Ricardo took seriously, calling him a very distinguished writer. This distinguished writer presents the following explanations of the overall process of social reproduction and circulation. Quote, I shall be asked how it is that these industrial entrepreneurs make such great profits, and from whom they can draw them. My reply is that they do so because they sell everything they produce dearer than it costs them to produce it. They sell, one, to one another for the whole of that part of their consumption which is destined to satisfy their own needs, and which they pay for with a part of their profits. 2. To the wage laborers, both those that they pay themselves and those that the idle capitalists pay. In this way, they receive back from the wage laborers their entire wages, with the exception of their small savings. 3. To the idle capitalists, who pay them with a part of their revenue that they have not already handed over to the workers directly employed by them, so that the entire rent that they pay these idle capitalists each year flows back to them in one of these ways or another. End quote. The capitalists, therefore, get rich firstly by taking advantage of each other and exchanging the part of the surplus value that they devote to their private consumption or consume as revenue. If this part of their surplus value or profits is £400, then this £400 becomes £500 if each party to the £400 sells his share to another party 25% too dear. Since all of them do the same thing, the outcome is the same as if they had sold to each other at the right price. It is simply that they need a quantity of money of £500 to circulate a commodity value of £400, and this would seem rather a method of impoverishing than enriching them, inasmuch as they would have to hold a large part of their total wealth unproductively in the useless form of means of circulation. The whole thing comes down to the fact that the capitalist class, despite the all-round nominal price increase of their commodities, have to distribute among themselves, for their private consumption, a commodity stock of only £400, but that they do each other the favor of circulating this £400 in commodity value with a quantity of money that is required for £500 of commodity value. In saying this, we entirely disregard the fact that a part of their profits, here and thus generally, is assumed to be a stock of commodities in which profit is represented. But what Destutt intends is precisely to explain the origin of this profit. The quantity of money needed to circulate it is a completely subordinate question. The mass of commodities in which the profit is represented therefore appears to stem from the fact that the capitalists not only sell this mass of commodities to one another, which is already very fine and profound, but also sell it to each other too dear. Thus we now know one source of capitalist enrichment. It comes to the same thing as the secret of Inspector Blazik, that great poverty derives from great pauvreté. 2. The same capitalists also sell to the wage laborers both those that they pay themselves and those that the idle capitalists pay. In this way, they receive back from the wage laborers their entire wages with the exception of their small savings. The reflux of money capital to the industrial capitalists, capital which was advanced in this form by the capitalist as wages to workers, constitutes, for Monsieur Destutt, the second source of enrichment of these capitalists. So if the capitalist class pays £100 to the workers in wages, say, and these workers can therefore buy from the capitalist class commodities to the same value of £100, so that the sum of £100 that the capitalists advance as buyers of labor power flows back to them on the sale of commodities of £100 to the workers, the capitalists are supposed to enrich themselves by this. It would appear, from the standpoint of ordinary common sense, that by means of this procedure, the capitalists would simply find themselves once more in possession of the £100 that they previously possessed. At the beginning, they had £100 in money, and they used this to buy £100 worth of labor power. For this £100 in money, the labor that is brought produces commodities of a value that, as far as we know up to now, is £100. By selling this £100 of commodities to the workers, the capitalists receive back £100 in money. The capitalists therefore again have £100 in money, and the workers have £100 in commodities that they themselves produced. How the capitalists are supposed to get rich in this way is anybody's guess. If the £100 in money did not flow back to them, then they would have first paid the workers £100 in money for their labor, and would secondly have had to give them the product of this labor, £100 worth of means of consumption, for nothing. The reflux might explain why the capitalists do not become any the poorer by this operation, but in no way how they become richer. A further question, moreover, is how the capitalists come to possess this £100 in money, and why the workers, instead of producing commodities on their own account, are forced to exchange their labor power for this £100. But this is something that a thinker of Destutt's caliber takes as self-explanatory. Destutt would not be quite satisfied with this solution. After all, he did not actually tell us that one can get rich by spending a sum of £100 and then receiving back an equal sum of £100. i.e. by the reflux of £100 in money. What he told us is that the capitalists get rich, quote, because they sell everything they produce dearer than it costs them to buy it. So the capitalists must additionally get rich in their transactions with the workers by selling them too dear. Excellent. Quote, they pay wages, and all this flows back to them by the spending of all these people, who pay dearer for them, for the products, than they cost them, the capitalists, in wages, end quote. Do the capitalists thus pay the workers £100 in wages and then sell the workers their own product for £120, so that both the £100 has flowed back to them and a further £20 has been obtained in addition? This is impossible. The workers can pay only with the money that they receive in the form of wages. If they receive £100 in wages from the capitalists, they can buy only for £100 and not for £120. This would not work at all. But there is still another way. The workers buy commodities from the capitalists for £100, but receive in actual fact only commodities to the value of £80. They have therefore been cheated out of £20, and the capitalist has certainly got £20 richer because he paid for labor power 20% below its value, or indirectly made a deduction of 20% from the nominal wage. The capitalist class would achieve the same end if they paid the workers only £80 in wages from the beginning, and subsequently supplied them with £80 in commodity value for this £80 in money. This would appear the normal way, taking the class as a whole, since according to Monsieur Destutt himself, the working class must receive sufficient wages, i.e. their wages must at least be sufficient to maintain their existence and working ability, quote, to procure them the barest subsistence, end quote. If the workers do not receive this sufficient wage, then this spells, quote, the death of industry, end quote, from page 208, as Destutt himself says, and is therefore, it would appear, not a means of enrichment for the capitalists. But whatever may be the wage that the capitalist class pays to the working class, this has a definite value, for example, £80. If the capitalist class pays £80 to the workers, it has to supply them with £80 in commodity value, and the reflux of the £80 does not enrich them. If it pays them £100 in money, and sells them a commodity value of £80 for £100, then it pays them 25% in money above their normal wages, but supplies them with that much less than this in commodities. In other words, the entire fund from which the capitalist class draws its profit is formed by a deduction from the normal wage, by payment of labor power below its value, i.e. below the value of the means of subsistence that are needed for the normal reproduction of the wage laborers. If the normal wage is paid, therefore, and this according to Destutt is what should happen, then there does not exist any fund for profit, neither for the industrial capitalist nor for the idle capitalist. Destutt would thus have to reduce the entire secret of how the capitalist gets rich to this: deduction from wages. The other funds of surplus value, which he refers to under headings 1 and 3, would then not exist. In all countries, therefore, where the money wage of the workers is reduced to a value of the means of consumption necessary for their subsistence as a class, there does not exist either a consumption fund or an accumulation fund for the capitalists, and so no fund for the existence of the capitalist class, and no capitalist class at all. And this would certainly be the case, according to Destutt, in all rich and developed, long civilized countries, for here, quote, in our old established societies, the fund from which wages are met is almost a constant quantity, end quote, from page 202. Even given this deduction from wages, therefore, the capitalists are not enriched because they first pay the workers £100 in money, and subsequently supply them with £80 worth of commodities for this £100. i.e., in fact, circulate £80 worth of commodities by means of a sum of money of £100, 25% more than needed, but rather because they appropriate, besides the surplus value, the part of the product in which the surplus value is represented, a further 20% of that part of the worker's product that should fall to them in the form of wages. In Destutt's foolish conception, the capitalist class would not gain any profit at all. They pay £100 for wages, and in return for this £100 give the workers £80 worth of commodities from their own product. In the next operation, however, they must again advance £100 for the same procedure. Thus, they achieve only the useless satisfaction of advancing £100 in money and supplying in return 80, instead of advancing £80 and supplying £80 worth of commodities for it. i.e., they constantly advance to no avail a money capital 25% greater than is needed for the circulation of their variable capital. This would indeed be a quite peculiar method of enrichment. 3. Finally, the industrial capitalist class sells, quote, to the idle capitalists, who pay them with the part of their revenue that they have not already handled over to the workers directly employed by them, so that the entire rent that they pay these idle capitalists each year flows back to them again in one of these ways or another, end quote. We have already seen that the industrial capitalists pay, quote, with a part of their profits for the whole of that part of their consumption which is destined to satisfy their own needs. Let us take it that their profits are £200. They consume £100, say, for their individual consumption. But the other half, a further £100, does not belong to them, but rather to the idle capitalists, i.e. the recipients of the ground rent, and the capitalists who lend money as interest. They must therefore pay these people £100. Let us say that out of this money, the latter need £80 for their own consumption, and £20 for the hire of servants, etc. They therefore buy means of consumption for £80 from the industrial capitalists. The latter thereby receives back, by parting with £80 worth of products, £80 in money, or 4/5 of the £100 that they paid to the idle capitalists under the headings of rent, interest, etc. Moreover, the class of servants, the direct wage laborers of the idle capitalists, has received £20 from its masters. It too uses this to buy means of consumption from the industrial capitalists to the tune of £20. The latter thereby receive back £20 in money, while they have parted with £20 in products, and this is the last fifth of the £100 that they paid to these idle capitalists as rent, interest, etc. At the close of the transaction, the industrial capitalists have received back the £100 in money that they remitted to the idle capitalists in payment of rent, interest, etc., while half of their surplus product, or £100, has been transferred from their hands into the consumption fund of the idle capitalists. It is evidently entirely superfluous, therefore, for the question we are dealing with here, to bring in the division of the £100 between the idle capitalists and their immediate wage laborers. The situation is quite simple. Their rent and interest, in short, the share of the surplus value of £200 that accrues to them, is paid them by the industrial capitalists in money, £100. With this £100, they buy means of consumption directly or indirectly from the industrial capitalists. They therefore pay back to them £100 in money and take means of consumption in exchange for £100. This is how the reflux of the £100 paid by the industrial capitalist to the idle capitalist has taken place. Is this reflux of money, as Destutt imagines, a means of enrichment for the industrial capitalists? Before the transaction, they had a sum of values of £200, 100 in money and 100 in means of consumption. After the transaction, they give only half of their original sum of values. They again have £100 in money, but they have lost the £100 in means of consumption that has been transferred to the hands of the idle capitalists. They are therefore £100 poorer instead of £100 richer. If, instead of this detour of first paying £100 in money and then receiving this £100 back again in payment for £100 worth of means of consumption, they get directly paid rent, or interest, etc., in the natural form of their product, then they would not receive any money back from the circulation sphere, as they would not have cast £100 of money into it. Payment in kind would have simply presented the matter in such a way that half the value of the surplus product of £200 was retained by the industrial capitalists themselves and the other half given away to the idle capitalists without an equivalent. Even Destutt would not have tried to present this as a means of enrichment. The land and the capital that the industrial capitalists borrow from the idle capitalists, and for which they have to pay them a part of the surplus value in the form of rent, interest, etc., is of course profitable for them, for it is one of the conditions of production, both of the product in general and of the part of the product that forms surplus product or in which the surplus value is represented. But this profit derives from the use of the borrowed land and capital, and not from the price that is paid for this. This price is rather a deduction from it. It would otherwise be necessary to maintain that the industrial capitalists would not become richer but poorer if they could keep the other half of the surplus value for themselves instead of giving it away. But this is the confusion that we are led to if phenomena of circulation, such as the reflux of money, are lumped together with the distribution of the product that is simply mediated by these phenomena of circulation. Despite all this, Destutt is still shrewd enough to note, quote, "Where do the revenue of these idle people come from? Do they not come from the rents that are paid to them, out of the profit of those who make the idler's capital work, i.e. those who use the funds of the former to pay a labor that produces more than it costs? In short, the industrialists? It is to these that one must always go, therefore, to find the source of all wealth. It is these who actually feed the wage laborers employed by the others." End quote. The payment of these rents, etc., is now a deduction from the profit of the industrialists. Previously, it was a means for them to get rich. But our Destutt has one consolation left. These brave industrialists handle the idle capitalists just as they treat one another in the workers. They sell them all commodities too dear. For example, 20% too dear. Only two things are possible now. Either the idle capitalists have, besides the £100 that they annually receive from the industrialists, further monetary resources, or they do not. In the first case, the industrialists sell them commodities in values of £100 at a price, say, of £120. They receive back for the sale of their commodities not only the £100 that they paid the idlers, but also a further £20 that actually forms new value for them. How does the account now stand? They have given £100 worth of commodities away for nothing, for the £100 in money with which part of it was paid for was their own money, a loss of £100. But they have received, besides this, £20 as an addition to the price above its value. This profit of £20, together with a loss of £100, makes a loss of £80, which is still a loss and can never be a profit. The cheating practiced towards the idle capitalists has reduced the industrialist loss, but it has in no way transformed their loss into a means of enrichment. This method will not work in the long run, however, as the idle capitalists cannot pay out of £120 each year if they receive only £100 in money. The other method, therefore, is that the industrialists sell commodities worth only £80 for the £100 in money that the idle capitalists pay them. In this case, as before, they give away £80 for nothing, in the form of rents, interest, etc. By way of this cheating, they have reduced the tribute to the idle capitalists, but it still exists, and the idle capitalists are in a position, according to the same theory in which prices depend on the goodwill of the sellers, to obtain £120 in future as rent, interest, etc. for their land and capital, instead of £100 as previously. This striking development is completely worthy of the profound thinker who, on the one hand, copies from Adam Smith the phrase that labor is the source of all wealth, that the industrial capitalists employ their capital in order to pay labor that reproduces it with a profit, and on the other hand concludes that these industrial capitalists, quote, feed all the other people, alone increase the public wealth, and create all our means of enjoyment. That it is not the capitalists who are fed by the workers, but the workers by the capitalists, and moreover, for the brilliant reason that the money with which the workers are paid does not remain in their hands, but always returns to the capitalists in payment for the goods that the workers produced. Quote, they merely receive with one hand and give back with the other. Their consumption must therefore be seen as produced by those who pay them. End quote from page 253. After this exhaustive presentation of social reproduction and consumption, mediated as it is by money circulation, Destutt continues, quote, "It is this that perfects the perpetuum mobile of wealth, a movement that, although badly understood, indeed, has rightly been called circulation, for it is in fact a circuit and always comes back to its point of departure. This is the point at which production is completed." End quote from pages 239 and 240. Destutt, that very distinguished writer, member of the Institut de France and the Philosophical Society of Philadelphia, and certainly a genuine luminary among vulgar economists, finally begs his readers to marvel at the wondrous clarity with which he depicts the course of the social process, the flood of light that he has shown on the object, and is even condescending enough to inform the reader where all this light emanates from. Quote, "It will be remarked, I trust, how this manner of considering the consumption of our wealth is in harmony with everything that we have said on the subject of its production and distribution, and at the same time, what a clear light it casts on the whole course of society. Where does this harmony and this lucidity come from? From the fact that we have encountered the truth. This recalls the effect of those mirrors in which objects are reflected accurately and in their true proportions when we place ourselves at the correct focal point, but where everything appears confused and disjointed when one is too close or too far away." End quote. Here you have bourgeois cretinism in its ultimate state of bliss.